The book of Acts of the Apostles has no ending. Paul enters Rome as a prisoner, and the story cuts off there. Not a trial, not a sentence, not a death. Over the next few minutes, you're going to go through all 28 complete chapters and see three things almost nobody ever shows you. The stones with the carved names of the officials who appear in this story. The Greek inscription that lets us date the life of Paul down to the month, and the one point where the author himself seems to get the decade wrong. I won't hide that last one, because a channel that only tells you what's convenient teaches you nothing. One thing before we start. First time here, I'm asking nothing. Stay and watch, and if it's not for you, you leave, that's fine. But if you already know how this channel works, hit like now before we begin. Not for me, because someone is searching for exactly this, and that button decides if it reaches them. Watch what I just said. Because it's not just a figure of speech. The character who dominates half the book disappears without any explanation, and the very last word the author writes in Greek is a single adverb, akoleitos, meaning unhindered, with no one forbidding it. Full stop. Imagine an 8-season series whose final episode ends with the main character walking into a courtroom, and then the credits roll. You never find out what happened inside. That's Acts, the most detailed document that exists about the first 30 years of Christianity, written by someone who, in several stretches, speaks in the first person plural. We set sail. We arrived, we stayed, and then he falls silent, right when the story reaches its most tense moment. 11 frightened men hid in a room in Jerusalem. 30 years later, their message was being preached inside the capital of the empire itself. How that happened is exactly what you're about to see. And so, you can see just how big those stones I promised you really are. One of them has an administrative title carved into it, so unusual that for centuries critics claim the author had simply invented it until it turned up carved in marble. Let's start with the basics almost nobody stops to explain. Where did this book come from? Acts wasn't born alone. It's the second half of a 2-volume work. Open the Gospel of Luke and read its very first sentence. It's addressed to a certain Theophilus. Many have undertaken to set the story in order, and the author investigated everything carefully from the start to write it in order. Now open Acts chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the first account, O Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach." Same recipient, same voice, same hand. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are really one single project split into 2 scrolls, most likely because a papyrus scroll had a physical length limit, and the whole work simply couldn't fit onto just one. Together they make up almost a quarter of the entire New Testament. No other author in the canon wrote as much, so who was he? The text never says, and right away we run into something uncomfortable. The book is anonymous. Luke's name got attached to it very early on. Irenaeus assumes it in the late 2nd century, as does an ancient list of books called the Muratorian Canon. And tradition identifies him as the physician, Paul's companion mentioned in the letters. There's an internal detail pointing in that direction. Starting in chapter 16, the narration suddenly changes pronoun. Until then, it told the story in 3rd person. He went, they entered. Then suddenly, we sought to set out for Macedonia. We. And that word "we" appears and disappears in specific stretches of the book, always tied to journeys by sea. Scholars have argued 200 years over what that means. Some say it's just the obvious answer. The author was on board. Others say it was just a literary convention used in ancient sea voyage narratives. There's no consensus. What there is an author with an obsession quite rare in religious literature of the time. Administrative titles. This man doesn't just write governor and stop there. He writes proconsul when it should be proconsul, tribune when it should be tribune, and for the magistrates of a Greek city uses a title found in no other surviving literary text. We'll return to that later, since it's where the book's credibility is on the line. Now the structure, what almost nobody explains, and what makes the whole book make sense. In the first chapter, right before leaving, Jesus tells his followers a line that works like a table of contents, that they will receive power and that they will be his witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Acts chapter 1 verse 8, that single sentence is the map for the entire book. The first 7 chapters happen in Jerusalem. 8 to 12, it spills into Judea and Samaria. 13 to 28, it leaves the Jewish world and crosses the Mediterranean to the capital of the empire. Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, the ends of the earth. The author isn't improvising here at all. He gave the outline on page 1, then followed it to the letter. And here it's worth holding on to something, because it's going to explain. The book's strange ending. If the stated goal was to reach the ends of the earth, and the book ends with the message firmly planted in Rome, then maybe the book isn't incomplete after all. Maybe it ended exactly where it meant to. Hold on to that thought. We're going to need it in 2 hours. Now then, let's go back to the mountain. It's the year 30 or 33 of our era. Scholars still argue which one, since it depends how you calculate the year of the crucifixion, with no settled agreement. And a group of Galileans is standing on a hillside east of Jerusalem, looking up at the sky. They've just lived through 7 impossible weeks. They watched their teacher die, buried him, and afterward, according to their own testimony, saw him alive. The book says he appeared to them over 40 days, speaking about the kingdom of God. During those 40 days, they ask a question revealing exactly what was on their minds. Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? That single question says it all. After all they'd seen, they were still hoping for exactly what any first-century Jew hoped for. A king who would drive out the Romans and restore the throne of David. They were still thinking in terms of politics, borders, an army. And the answer they get is neither yes nor no, it's a change of subject. It is not for you to know the times or the seasons. You will receive power, you will be my witnesses, and then he leaves. The page says he was lifted up, and a cloud hid him from their sight, and they just stood there frozen, staring at the sky, until 2 men dressed in white asked them why they were still looking up. Stop on that image for a second, because it's the opening scene of everything that comes next. 11 men on a hillside with vague instructions, no leader, no money, no structure, no permission from anyone, and orders to bear witness before the entire world. None of them was a priest, none was a scribe, none had any rabbinical training. Later on, when the temple authorities interrogate them, the text describes them with 2 Greek words worth translating carefully, agrammatoi and idiotai. They don't mean stupid, they mean without. Formal instruction, ordinary private citizens, common people, not professionals. They were laymen with no credentials. They went down to the city and shut themselves in. The text is precise. They went up to the upper room where they stayed, and it gives a full list of names. Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. And it adds a detail most popular versions of this story leave out. They were there with the women, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers, the very same brothers who, according to the Gospel of John, did not believe in him while he was alive. Now, here they are, in that room. One of them will end up leading the Jerusalem community, and you'll see him again later in this video, presiding over a council. And in that room, with about 120 people gathered together according to the text, the first administrative decision in Christian history takes place. There's a vacancy, Judas. Here I need to be fully transparent with you, because this is one of those points where most channels prefer to skip past. The Bible tells the story of Judas's death twice, and the two versions don't actually agree. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas returns the money, throws it into the temple, and hangs himself. The priests then use the coins to buy a potter's field. In Acts chapter 1, Peter says Judas acquired a field with the price of his wickedness, and that he fell head first, burst open in the middle, and his insides spilled out. Did he hang himself or fall? Did he buy the field, or did the priests buy it? Classic harmonizations exist, and they're reasonable. That he hanged himself and the body fell afterward, for example, or the field was bought with his money and so it's attributed to him. They're possible, but neither one is actually in the text. The account itself doesn't say it. There are our own reconstructions to fit together two accounts that arrived by different paths and agree on what matters most. Judas betrayed, Judas died. There was a field, there was money. Accounts differ only on how. That's what we have. Knowing it doesn't make you a worse Bible reader, it makes you a more serious one. What's interesting is what they do with the vacancy. Peter stands up and argues from the Psalms that the position must be filled, and they put forward two candidates, Joseph, called Barsabbas, nicknamed the Just, and Matthias. The requirement they set is extremely strict, and it's worth hearing. It had to be someone who had been with them the whole time, from John's baptism until the day Jesus was taken up. In other words, an eyewitness to the entire journey. And then they cast lots. Sounds strange, a lottery to choose an apostle, but it was an ancient procedure and perfectly normal in the Jewish world. That's how priestly duties were assigned and how the land was divided up in the book of Joshua. What almost nobody notices is this. It's the very last time in the entire New Testament that anyone makes a decision by casting lots. After chapter 2, never again. From that point on, decisions get made in a different way, and the book is very explicit about how. That contrast isn't accidental. It's intentional. Matthias is chosen, and with that, Matthias disappears, and from the New Testament forever. Not one more line mentions him again. Now notice something before we move on, because it's the key to the whole book, and defines what this story is really about. If you had to invent a religion and wanted it to sound believable, you would not write this chapter this way. Your heroes wouldn't ask a politically naive question right before their teacher's departure. They wouldn't stand frozen staring at the sky until someone called them out. They wouldn't pick their new leader by throwing marked stones, and you certainly wouldn't leave two different versions of the traitor's death. Invented stories smooth over rough edges. This one doesn't. That detail, the book keeping what's uncomfortable, is going to repeat so many times over the next 2 hours that I want you to start counting. Fights between leaders, discrimination inside the community, an apostle, accused by his people, 2 missionaries who split up angrily and never traveled together again. All of that is in there, nobody erased it. If this is already hooking you, hit like now, not for the algorithm, because in a few minutes we're going to reach the part where 3,000 people get baptized in a single day, and I'm going to show you exactly where. That many people actually fit with the archaeological excavation in hand, because what happened 50 days after that Passover broke the room that had been locked from the inside. 50 days after Passover, Jerusalem celebrated a feast called, in Hebrew, Shavuot, and in Greek, Pentecost, which simply means 50th. It was one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. Jewish men were required to go up to the temple, which means the city was anything but calm. It was overflowing, pilgrims from half the Mediterranean sleeping wherever they could, money changers working flat out, the temple running at full capacity. That's the setting. Hold on to that detail about the crowd, because without it, what comes next won't make sense. Jesus' followers were gathered together, and the book describes what happened using 2 very careful comparisons. It says a sound came from heaven, like a mighty rushing wind that it blew, so to speak, and it says tongues appeared to them, distributed like fire, resting on each one of them like fire. Notice the precision. The author doesn't say there was wind, he says there was a sound that sounded like wind. He doesn't say there was fire, he says. Something was seen that looked like fire, shaped like tongues. He is describing the indescribable with the honesty of someone reaching for an analogy and flagging it as an analogy. Legendary accounts are rarely this careful. And then they began to speak. Here we need to slow down because this is one of the worst told passages in the whole Bible. You'll find popular versions where each apostle gets assigned one language. Peter spoke Egyptian, John spoke Latin, James got Parthian. It's a lovely scene. It just isn't in the text. The account doesn't assign languages to individuals. It says 2 things, and only 2. They began speaking in other tongues, and the crowd reacted because each person heard them in their own language. It uses 2 different Greek words for this, glossa for what they speak, and dialectos for what the crowd recognizes, exactly what it sounds like, speech native to a place, the accent and language you were born into. The literal phrase is almost crushingly simple. Each heard them speaking in his own dialect, the one he was born into, and then comes the list. And the list matters enormously. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, of Judea, of Cappadocia, of Pontus and Asia, of Phrygia and Pamphylia, of Egypt and the regions of Africa beyond Cyrene, Romans just passing through, Cretans, Arabs. That's not a rhetorical flourish, it's a map. It starts in the east, in the Parthian Empire, beyond the Roman frontier, comes down through Mesopotamia, up into Asia Minor, crosses to Egypt and North Africa, jumps to Rome, and closes with the islands and the desert, tracing a circle around the whole known world. Why were people from all those places in Jerusalem? Because the Jewish diaspora was enormous, and it's well documented outside the Bible. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish thinker alive at the same time as this scene, writes that his countrymen populated a good part of Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and the islands. Josephus, the Jewish historian of that same century, describes established communities in Babylon and all along the coast, and archaeology confirms it. There are remains of ancient synagogues scattered across the Mediterranean, and an inscription found. In Jerusalem, the so-called Theudas inscription mentions a synagogue built specifically to host those coming from abroad. In other words, the scene the page describes is exactly what independent history would expect to find in that city, at that feast, on that day. The reaction on the street splits in two, and that also rings true. Some are stunned and ask what this means. Others mock them and say they're drunk on new wine. And that is when the fisherman, Simon. Peter stands up, the very same man who, weeks earlier, had denied even knowing Jesus in front of a servant girl. The same man who in the Gospels keeps talking too much, promising too much, and failing at the worst moment. That man stands up in front of an international crowd in the city where they had just executed his teacher for sedition, and he gives a speech. And one note, because it's best not to invent things, the text doesn't say exactly where in Jerusalem this happened. That it was near the temple is the most common reconstruction, since that's where the crowd of pilgrims was that day, but it is a reconstruction. Not a fact stated on the page. His speech opens with humor, something almost nobody ever mentions. He says these men are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the 3rd hour of the day, 9 in the morning. Nobody is drunk at 9 in the morning. And then he builds an argument in 3 movements that's worth seeing taken apart, because it becomes the template for all later Christian preaching. Movement 1. What you're seeing was already foretold. Yes, the prophet Joel said, "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy." Notice the detail. Sons and daughters, young and old, male servants and female servants. Peter isn't describing an elite. He's describing an outpouring that ignores every social category. Movement 2. The man I'm telling you about was certified to you by deeds you yourselves witnessed in your own city, and here he uses an extremely harsh formula. This man, handed over by God's set plan, you seized and killed, crucifying him by the hands of wicked men. He's speaking in front of people who were actually there. This isn't a preacher describing something distant. It's one witness pointing at other witnesses. Movement 3, the sharpest one quotes sharpest. Psalm 16, where David says, "God will not leave his soul in Hades, nor let his Holy One see decay." And then he argues, "Brothers, I can say to you plainly that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this very day." That argument only works if it's verifiable, and it was. David's tomb was a well-known monument in Jerusalem. Josephus even says Herod the Great tried to break into it looking for treasure. Peter is, in effect, saying, if you think the psalm was about David, go check for yourselves. The body is still there, the tomb is. Full of the one, set against the empty tomb of the other. The text says they were cut to the heart, a physical expression. Literally, they were pierced through, and they asked what they should do. Peter's answer comes in 4 parts. Repent, be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then the text drops a number. About 3,000 people were added that day. Now this is where I like to ask the practical question almost nobody asks, because practical questions are what separate. A story anchored in reality from a fairy tale. Where do you baptize 3,000 people in a single day, in a city with no river, on a dry plateau, in the middle of summer? And it turns out archaeology has a very concrete answer from the excavations south of the Temple Mount, led by Benjamin Mazar. Starting in the late 1960s, dozens of ritual pools carved into the rock turned up, the so-called mikvaot, concentrated right at the entry zone to the temple by the southern staircase. They had steps going down with a divider between the impure side and the pure side. And they were there, precisely because thousands of pilgrims needed to purify themselves before entering the sacred precinct. During a pilgrimage feast, that infrastructure was in full use. In other words, the only place in the ancient world with the installed capacity to immerse thousands of people. In a single day was exactly that neighborhood, on exactly those days of the calendar. Now slow down with me. The account doesn't say they were baptized right there. It doesn't say that. I won't sell you a certainty the document doesn't give. What I am saying is that the practical objection that this is logistically impossible falls apart the moment you look under the city's streets, and something uncomfortable for the other side. If someone invented this scene centuries later, far from there, they'd hardly choose a number demanding such specific infrastructure. There's one more detail I want to give you because it changes the meaning of the whole chapter. Go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, a humanity united by a single language that decides to build a name for itself, and the result is the confusion of languages and the scattering of peoples. The punishment was not understanding each other. Now come back to Jerusalem. People from 15 different origins, each with their own language, and suddenly everyone understands the same thing. Notice what doesn't happen. The languages don't disappear. Nobody ends up speaking a single language. Diversity is kept intact, and yet there is understanding. This isn't Babel undone, it's Babel passed through. And the chapter closes with the description of how they lived, one of the most quoted and most poorly understood pages in the book. It says they devoted themselves steadily to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer, that all who believed held everything in common, and sold their property and possessions, and divided it according to each person's need, that they were at the temple every single day. Notice that they were still going to the temple. They didn't yet feel like a separate religion, and they broke bread in their homes, eating with glad and sincere hearts. And then a phrase appears that is a time bomb, even if it doesn't look like one. Enjoying favor with all the people, favor with all the people. That state of grace is going to last exactly until the next public miracle, because the next thing they did was heal a man at the busiest gate of the temple in front of absolutely everyone. And that's where their goodwill ran out. It was 3 in the afternoon. The account says the 9th hour, one of the times for public prayer at the temple, and therefore one of the busiest moments for foot traffic on the steps. Peter and John are going up, and at the gate a man is sitting. The page calls it the beautiful gate, and almost nobody mentions this. We don't know for certain which gate that was. The name doesn't appear in any other surviving ancient source. The usual candidates are the gate of Nicanor, made of Corinthian bronze and famous for its shine, or the Eastern Gate. It's a minor unknown, and I'd rather you know that than have me manufacture false certainty. About the man, we do know concrete things. Lame from his mother's womb, and he was carried there every day and set down. And later on, the text adds a detail that works like a seal of verification. He was over 40 years old. In a city that size, a crippled beggar over 40 years old, stationed at the busiest entrance to the sanctuary, was not a stranger. He was a face that everyone had been seeing for decades. He asks for alms, and Peter says a line that has become so famous we almost don't hear it anymore. "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you." And he takes him by the right hand. And the text says his feet and ankles were instantly made strong. And entering the temple with them, he walked, jumped, and praised God. Here I want to pause and take apart something repeated constantly in Christian videos. Even though it works in favor of our own side, You'll hear people say that phrases like feet and ankles prove the author was a physician because he supposedly uses technical medical vocabulary. That idea had a lot of traction in the 19th century, largely because of a study by a scholar named Hobart, and it was demolished more than a century ago by Henry Cadbury of Harvard in a study on Luke's style and literary method that he published at the end of the 1910s. Cadbury did the obvious thing. He compared that vocabulary with Greek authors who were not doctors, historians, novelists, Josephus, and he showed that almost all those words were simply normal, educated vocabulary of the period. Then he finished it off with an even stronger argument: the physician of antiquity, unlike today's, barely had a technical vocabulary of his own, so there was no exclusive lexicon that would give away a professional. That's the conclusion most scholars hold today. Vocabulary alone can't prove the author was a physician. He may have been one. Tradition says so, and there's reason to take that seriously, just not because of the words he uses. I'd rather give you one argument less than one false one. What happens next is predictable. A crowd gathers at Solomon's portico, and Peter preaches. Again and again, he uses the same pattern with a line that hits hard. You killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. But then he adds something that softens the blow without dulling its edge. I know you did it in ignorance, as did your rulers too, and that's why they arrest them. Notice who orders the arrest, because the detail is precise. The priests, the captain of the temple guard, and the Sadducees, not the Pharisees, the Sadducees. And the page explains the exact motive. They were resentful that they were teaching and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees, according to Josephus and to the Gospels, did not believe in resurrection. The arrest wasn't for talking about Jesus, it was for talking about the resurrected. The next day they're interrogated, and the text names those presiding: Annas and Caiaphas. Both men existed, and both are documented outside the Bible. Josephus mentions them both, and in 1990, workers laboring in the Peace Forest south of Jerusalem accidentally broke through the roof of a first-century burial chamber. Inside were several ossuaries, limestone boxes, where bones were kept after decomposition. One of them, especially ornate, had a name carved into it in Aramaic: Yehoseph bar Caiapha, Joseph son of Caiaphas. Now, careful with the enthusiasm, the identification with the high. Priest of the Gospels is the majority reading, and the one held by the museums that display it, but it isn't unanimous. Some specialists dispute the spelling of the name, and warn that Caiaphas may have been a family surname rather than referring to one single individual. In 2011, another ossuary was published of irregular provenance, bearing the inscription Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, son of Caiaphas, which reinforces the family's existence. In short, what we have is a real priestly family, with a real name, buried in real tombs in the city, and in exactly the century of the account. And right there, in front of those people, comes the scene I find the most disarming in the whole chapter. The narrator says that seeing the boldness of Peter and John, and knowing they were uneducated, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus, not from an argument, from a resemblance. The council is cornered and knows it, and the narrator says so plainly. Seeing the healed man standing there with them, they had nothing to say against it. A 40-year-old cripple walking Jerusalem cannot be refuted with theology, so they do the only thing they can: threaten them and forbid them to speak in that name. And Peter answers with the line that would become the most cited argument of conscience in Western history: "Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God." They let them go, and they go back to their own people and do something worth noticing, because it reveals what kind of people they were. They start to pray. And what do they ask for? Not protection, not fire falling on the Sanhedrin. They ask for boldness and for signs to keep happening. The text says the place where they were gathered shook. And right after that comes the description of communal life that has fueled 2,000 years of political debate. The whole multitude of believers was of one heart and one soul, and no one claimed that anything he possessed was his own. And there was no needy person among them, because those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the proceeds, and laid them at the apostles' feet. This gets quoted constantly as history's first communism, and it's worth slowing down, because the book itself, 2 paragraphs later, says the opposite in Peter's own words: "While it remained, was it not yours? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal?" Translated, nobody was obligated. Property wasn't abolished, it was made available. In fact, private homes kept right on existing, and the book proves it constantly, because the community keeps meeting over and over in the homes of specific people with names and surnames. This isn't an economic system, it's a voluntary radical practice of solidarity inside a group. And right in that exact context comes the most uncomfortable story in the book. The text has just presented a positive example, a Levite from Cyprus named Joseph, whom the apostles nicknamed Barnabas, who sold a piece of land and brought the money. Remember that name, it's going to matter twice more in this video. And right after, Ananias and Sapphira appear. They sell a property, keep back part of the price by mutual agreement and bring the rest, pretending it's the whole amount. Peter confronts him with a question: "Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit?" And then the key line, the one that defines the whole episode: "You have not lied to men, but to God." Ananias falls down dead. 3 hours later, his wife walks in, knowing nothing, repeats the same lie, and falls down too. I'm not going to soften this. It's a harsh text. It's one of the passages that has driven the most people away from Christianity, and anyone who tells you it's a nice story hasn't actually read it. But I can give you 2 keys almost nobody ever gives you, and they completely change how it reads. The first is linguistic. The offense the text names isn't greed, it's false. Representation. In Greek, the word used for what they did with the money means to set aside for oneself, to secretly appropriate, and it's exactly the same verb the Greek translation of the Old Testament uses to describe what Achan did in the book of Joshua when he hid consecrated plunder. The author is deliberately drawing a parallel with an ancient episode of sacred fraud. This isn't a punishment for not giving enough, it's a punishment for theatrically staging. A total surrender that wasn't total. The second key is historical, and it's one of the most fascinating things you can say about this passage. About 30 kilometers from Jerusalem by the Dead Sea, that same century, another Jewish community existed that practiced something strikingly similar. We know this because at Qumran, their internal regulations turned up, in the document known as the Community Rule. It establishes that whoever joins hands over his possessions and his labor to the administrator of the congregation, and only after the second year, if he passes the review, does his property merge with the groups. And in the disciplinary code of that same text, just a few columns later, there's a rule written for one very specific offense. Whoever deliberately lies about property will be excluded from the pure meal of the many for a year, and his ration will be cut by a quarter. Read that again. Another Jewish community in the same region, in the same century, with goods held in common, and with a penalty written specifically for someone who lied about what he contributed. And that changes two things at once. What Ananias and Sapphira did wasn't a prank. It was the single most serious codified offense you could commit inside a Jewish community of. Shared goods in the first century, and a written penalty existed, thought up exactly for people like them. So the scene in Acts, which sounds like legend when read in isolation, fits naturally into a real, documented neighboring environment. That resolves the harshness of the punishment, not really. Death, against a year of reduced rations, is still a huge gap. The text doesn't explain itself there, and I won't explain it away with a comforting line either. What it says, and says twice, is the effect. Great fear came upon the whole church, and upon all who heard these things. And that verse has another hidden detail. It's the very first time in the entire book that the word ecclesia, church, appears. The movement starts calling itself by that name right after the darkest episode in its early history, not after a triumph, after a double funeral. What follows is a stretch of brutal growth, and a verse shows up that also gets told wrong almost every time. It says they carried the sick out into the streets and laid them on cots and mats, so that when Peter passed by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. Look closely at what it says and what it doesn't say. It says people did this, that this was the popular expectation. It does not say the shadow actually healed anyone. The text reports the crowd's behavior, it does not validate a technique. It's a small difference, and it's exactly the difference between reading a text and projecting onto it. And predictably, they're all arrested again, and this time the outcome is stranger. The account says an angel opened the prison doors at night and led them out with a rather reckless order. Go, stand in the temple, and tell the people the whole message of this life. In other words, the jailbreak ends with the escapees right back in the most public place in the city at dawn, doing exactly what had gotten them locked up in the first place. The scene the next morning has a magnificent, unintentional humor to it. The guards arrive at the prison, find it securely locked, the sentries at their posts, but inside, there's nobody there. And while the council is trying to understand what happened, someone walks in and tells them, the men you put in prison are standing in the temple teaching the people. They bring them back without force. The text is careful to note, because they were afraid of the people. And the high priest scolds them with a line that, without meaning to, is a compliment. You have filled Jerusalem with your teaching. The council wants them dead. And then a name stands up, Gamaliel. I need you to know who he is, because he's one of the few characters in Acts who appears by name in later Jewish literature. Rabban Gamaliel the Elder is a major figure of Pharisaic Judaism, mentioned in the Mishnah, which preserves legal rulings of his. One of its tractates even says that when Rabban Gamaliel the Elder died, the glory of the Torah ceased. And this same book of Acts later on will have Paul himself claim that he was trained at Gamaliel's feet. His intervention here is a brilliant exercise in political prudence. He basically tells them, stay out of it. If this is of men, it will fall apart on its own. If it's of God, you won't be able to destroy it, and you risk finding yourselves fighting against God. And to back up the argument, he gives two examples of earlier movements that dissolved on their own. one led by a certain Theudas with about 400 men, and another by Judas the Galilean in the days of the census. And right here, exactly here, is the single most serious historical problem in the whole book of Acts. I promised I wouldn't hide it from you, so here it is. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us in Book 20 of his Antiquities that during the term of the procurator Cuspius Theudas, a man named Theudas appeared. Presenting himself as a prophet, he convinced a large part of the population to take up their possessions and follow him to the Jordan, and he promised he would part the river. Theudas sent cavalry, they killed many, captured Theudas alive, beheaded him, and carried his head to Jerusalem. The problem is the date. Cuspius Theudas governed Judea between the years 44 and 46, and Gamaliel's speech happens roughly 10 years before that. And there's a second problem stacked on top of the first. Gamaliel says that after Theudas, Judas, the Galilean, rose up in the days of the census, and the census of Quirinius is dated to the year 6 of our era. So if Gamaliel's Theudas were the same one as Josephus's, the order would be reversed, and on top of that, the speech would be citing as past an event that hadn't happened yet. This isn't some internet objection. It's one of the classic discussions in academic commentaries on Acts, and it carries over 2 centuries of ink behind it. Let me give you the 3 proposed ways out, along with what each one has for and against it. Option 1. They were 2 different people. In favor, the name Theudas is a shortened form of Theodore or Theodotus, and it wasn't rare. Besides, the 2 movements don't even resemble each other, Gamaliel speaks of. About 400 men, while Josephus describes a considerable crowd. And above all, Josephus himself tells us that after Herod the Great's death in the year 4th BC, Judea was flooded with uprisings and improvised leaders. It was a chaotic, poorly documented period. The archaeologist William Ramsay summed it up bluntly. The period is very obscure, and Josephus is practically our only authority. Against, it's an argument from silence. There could have been another Theudas, but we don't have a single trace of him. Option 2, the author of Acts read Josephus and got confused. This one deserves attention. It has an unsettling detail. In Antiquities, right after telling the story of Theudas, Josephus moves on to the governorship of Tiberius Julius Alexander and mentions he crucified the sons of Judas the Galilean, in passing reminding the reader who Judas was, the one who stirred up the people in the days of the census. So in Josephus, the sequence Theudas and then Judas the Galilean appears in exactly that order for purely narrative reasons. An author who had read that passage years earlier and reproduced it from memory could easily have mistaken that sequence for chronology. In favor, it explains the far too exact coincidence of the pairing. Against, it forces Acts to be dated after the publication of Antiquities around the year 90, and that runs head-on into another argument we'll see at the end of this video about the book's abrupt ending. You can't have it both ways. Option 3, the author simply got it wrong. Ancient historians made mistakes. Josephus himself has demonstrable mistakes, and nobody throws him in the trash over it. So a secondary detail inside a speech reproduced from memory is exactly the kind of thing that slips first. Which one is correct? There's no consensus, and I'd rather tell you that straight with all 3 cards on the table than sell you just one and hide the other 2. What I do want you to weigh is the proportion. We're talking about one detail inside one speech in a book that, across 28 chapters, gets it right on administrative titles. Extremely rare. with officials' names that turn up carved in stone, and with shipping routes modern sailors have verified. A story that never gets a single thing wrong isn't a historical account, it's propaganda. A story that gets it right, in hundreds of verifiable details and misses on one, looks far more like a real document written by a real person. Let's go back to the council chamber. They take Gamaliel's advice halfway. They don't kill them, but they flog them, and the account itself. Notes what they did afterward, with a line that's still unsettling. They left the council's presence rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer disgrace for the sake of the name. They walked out happy, with their backs torn open. The next thing that fractures the community doesn't come from outside, it comes from within, and it has to do with food and with language. The group had grown too fast, and inside it there were two distinct kinds of Jews. There were the ones the text calls Hebrews, local Aramaic-speaking, and there were the Hellenists, diaspora Jews raised abroad who spoke Greek, many of them having returned to Jerusalem to live out their final years near the temple. That phenomenon is documented. It was common for diaspora Jews to retire to Jerusalem, which is why the city had an unusually high proportion of widows of foreign origin, with no local family to support them. And then the complaint breaks out. The Hellenist widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. Here's the first thing. I want you to notice. The account tells it, puts it in writing. History's very first Christian community had an internal conflict over discrimination by origin and by language only weeks after being born, and the movement's official document records it instead of covering it up. Hold on to that too. And now the second thing, which is even better, the solution. The 12 call the community together, say they aren't going to abandon teaching in order to wait tables, and ask them to choose 7 men of good reputation to handle the matter, and the community elects 7. Listen to the names: Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. All 7 names are Greek. All 7. Think about that. The aggrieved group was the Greek-speaking minority, and the Hebrew majority controlling the funds didn't put one of their own in charge. They handed the entire administration of the money to the group that had complained. Even the last man on the list wasn't Jewish by birth, but a convert from Antioch in Syria. That's the kind of decision an invented movement doesn't make, and a biased chronicler doesn't record. And in passing, another precision almost nobody makes. The text never calls these 7 deacons. The Greek word diakonos doesn't appear here. What appears is the verb to serve, and that's all. Identifying these 7 with the later office of deacon is a reading from the church, centuries afterward. Reasonable as an interpretation, but not what the page actually says. And then one of them, the first name on the list, does something nobody had asked him to do. He starts arguing in the synagogues. Stephen, the book says, argued with people from the synagogue of the freedmen, with Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and with men from Cilicia and Asia. Hold on to that last detail, Cilicia, the province whose capital was Tarsus, the city of Saul. It's very possible they're describing, without saying so, the exact circle the young Pharisee moved in, the one about to appear at this scene's end. Since they can't win the argument, they change tactics, bribe witnesses, and the charge they build is textbook. He speaks blasphemous words. Against this holy place and against the law, against the place, against the temple. Stephen's response is the longest speech in the whole book. It takes up almost an entire chapter, and most people skim it because it looks like a dull rundown of Israel's history. It isn't. It's a legal strategy. Look at it this way. They accuse him of speaking against the temple. So what does he do? He walks through Israel's history, pointing out where God appeared every time. To Abraham, he appeared in Mesopotamia before he owned a single square foot of land in the Promised Land. Joseph he sustained in Egypt in a foreign prison. To Moses he appeared in the desert of Midian in a bush on pagan soil and told him to take off his sandals because the ground he was standing on was holy. And in the wilderness God dwelled in a portable tent, something set up, taken down, and carried along. The whole speech keeps stacking up examples of a God who reveals himself outside the territory, outside the building, outside the system, and only at the very end does he drop the conclusion, quoting the prophet. Isaiah, "The Most High does not dwell in houses made with hands." He isn't denying the temple, he's denying that God is confined inside it. And for a court whose authority, whose income, and whose whole reason for existing depended on that building, it was the most dangerous sentence he could possibly say. And then he takes the step that seals his fate. He drops the history lesson and points straight at them. "You stiff-necked people," he says, "you always resist the Holy Spirit. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute?" A technical note is worth making here because you'll run into it if you study this chapter seriously, something that looks like a mistake and isn't. Stephen's speech has several details that don't exactly match the Hebrew Old Testament. The number of people who went down to Egypt or the place where the patriarchs were buried. The explanation isn't mysterious. They match the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that Greek-speaking Jews used, and alternative Jewish traditions that circulated at the time. It isn't a carelessness. It's the fingerprint of a Hellenistic speaker quoting the Bible he read. That the author of Acts didn't smooth it into something more polished says something good about him. The ending is a lynching, and the narrator doesn't hide what it is. There's no verdict, no formal sentence. It says that crying out with a loud voice, they covered their ears and rushed at him together, and dragging him out of the city, they stoned him. Whether this was a legal execution or a mob killing is another old debate, since the Gospel of John states that under Roman occupation, the Jewish council had no authority to carry out executions. The scene as written reads like an explosion, and in the middle of the horror, the account itself drops an almost absurdly mundane detail. The witnesses laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul, a young man watching coats. Stephen's last words come in 2 lines, and both are a deliberate echo. "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit," and then, on his knees, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Anyone who knows the Gospel of Luke will recognize immediately where those 2 lines come from. The author is saying, without saying it, that the disciple died the way his master did. And from there, a persecution breaks loose that empties the city of believers. And here comes the paradox that defines the rest of the whole book. The text says, "Everyone was scattered through the lands of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles." And 2 verses later, those who had been scattered were going everywhere proclaiming the gospel. The plan to destroy the movement became the very mechanism that spread it. And before moving on, I want to plant a piece we're going to need in about an hour and a half when we reach the moment they arrest Paul in the temple. In Jerusalem, there was a low wall separating the outer courtyard, open to everyone, from the inner precinct reserved for Jews, and on that wall there were stone signs. In 1871, The archaeologist Charles Clermont-Ganneau found one of those blocks, reused in a Jerusalem building. It's written in Greek, and in short it says that no foreigner may pass beyond the balustrade into the sacred precinct, and that whoever is caught doing so will be responsible for his own resulting death. That block sits today in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and in 1936, a second fragment of the same text turned up, now kept in Jerusalem. Josephus describes exactly these warning signs in 2 of his works. In other words, there was a death penalty written down and publicly posted for crossing a physical line inside the temple. Remember that, because 20 chapters from now, someone is going to accuse Paul of exactly that. And that accusation is going to change everything. Now, let's turn to what happened to those who fled, because one of them did something no respectable Jew of his time would have done voluntarily. He went to Samaria. Samaria wasn't just another region. It was the enemy next door, centuries of mutual hostility, a rival cult on Mount Gerizim, whose sanctuary had been razed by a Jewish ruler in the 2nd century before Christ, and a mutual contempt so solid that in the Gospels it functions as a synonym for maximum distance. And that's where Philip arrives, not an apostle, one of the 7 put in charge of distributing food. The narrator says the city was filled with joy, and that among those who believed and were baptized was a well-known figure, a man named Simon, who practiced magic, and whom the people of the city, from the least to the greatest, called the great power of God. When in Jerusalem they hear that Samaria had received the message, they send Peter and John, and something happens that has generated entire libraries of debate. The Samaritans were already baptized, but the text says the Holy Spirit had not yet come down on any of them, and that they only received it when the 2 apostles laid hands on them. Why that delay? The account itself never explains it. The most common reading among commentators is that it mattered enormously for Jerusalem to be present at the founding moment of the Samaritan community, so that a parallel rival church wouldn't be born, replaying the same schism that had been splitting the 2 peoples for centuries. It's a reasonable interpretation, and it's only that, an interpretation. The page itself doesn't say it. What it does say is what Simon did. He saw the gesture, saw its effect, and offered money. "Give me this power too," he says. Peter's answer is a burst of verbal violence rare in this book. "May your money perish with you because you thought God's gift could be bought with money." And now stop for a second, because this man left something behind that you're using without even realizing it. That episode left a word in the language when, in the Middle Ages, canon law needed a name. For the crime of buying and selling church offices, they took this man's own, simony. Even today, when someone buys a religious position with money, the word used comes from the name of a 1st century Samaritan who tried to pay for a gift. And here, a warning, because around this character a lot has been built up. You'll find spectacular stories about Simon Magus founding the first great heresy, traveling to Rome, facing off against Peter in a duel of powers, and dying while trying to fly. None of that is in Acts. Those stories come from later. Authors Justin Martyr and Irenaeus in the 2nd century, and above all, an apocryphal account called the Acts of Peter. Their later Christian tradition, not information from the book we're actually reading. What this book says is far more sober and far more human. Simon gets scared and asks for prayer, and the story leaves him right there, unresolved. What happens to Philip next feels like a script jump, and it's one of the best-built scenes in the book. He's told to go down the road from Jerusalem to Gaza, which the page calls desert, and on. That road he runs into a caravan, and inside a carriage, a very high-ranking official. The text says he was an Ethiopian eunuch in charge of the entire treasury of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. And here there are three things almost always told wrong. Let's go one at a time. First, Candace was not. Her name, it was her title. In the kingdom of Cush, whose capital was Meroe, the queen mother held the title of Kandake, and that title appears in several Greek and Latin authors of the period. Strabo even describes the clash between Kandake and the Roman troops in Egypt, who systematically mistook it for a personal name. The text of Acts curiously gets it right. It says Queen of the Ethiopians and adds the title. It doesn't say a woman named Candace. Second, Ethiopia here isn't modern Ethiopia. In Greek geographic vocabulary, Ethiopia designated the lands south of Egypt, essentially what today is Sudan. The kingdom of Meroe was a genuine African power with its own pyramids that are still standing, its own writing system and trade with. The Mediterranean, and third, the most important of all, this man was a eunuch, and in the law of Moses, in Deuteronomy, there's an explicit rule excluding eunuchs from the assembly, a man who had traveled thousands of kilometers to worship in Jerusalem, and who, because of his physical condition, could not enter beyond a certain point. A foreigner, mutilated, extremely wealthy, and spiritually excluded, heading home. And he's reading when Philip finds him, the scroll of Isaiah, specifically the passage about the servant led like a lamb to the slaughter. Now hold on, because this is one of the most beautiful connections in the entire Bible, and almost nobody points it out. If that man had kept unrolling that very same scroll, just 3 chapters further along, he would have reached a verse saying, "Let not the eunuch say, I am a dry tree, for God will give him in his house and within his walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters." The answer to his exclusion sat in the very scroll he held in his hands, just inches further on. One technical detail while we're at it. The account itself says Philip heard him reading. Reading aloud was the normal practice in antiquity, which is why the scene works. But watch out, because a very repeated exaggeration circulates here, that in the ancient world it was impossible to read silently. That isn't true. Studies in classical philology, Bernard Knox's in the 60s, and later Gavrilov's and Bernier's, documented clear cases of silent reading in Greek and Latin sources. The accurate thing to say is that reading aloud was the norm, not that the other way was unheard of. A small correction, but it's the difference between repeating a fact and actually checking it. Philip explains the passage to him, and the eunuch asks to be baptized at the first place with water they find. And here's a textual criticism detail most channels tend to skip. If you open an Old Spanish language Bible at this point, you'll find a verse where Philip sets a condition, and the eunuch answers with a confession of faith. If you open a modern Bible, that verse shows up in brackets, in a footnote, or simply isn't there at all. The reason is simple and well established. It's missing from the oldest Greek manuscripts and shows up in later copies. The majority reading among scholars is that it was a liturgical note that at some point migrated into the body of the text. This isn't a scandal or a conspiracy, it's simply how the study of manuscripts works, and serious Bibles mark it right there on the page. The chapter closes with Philip vanishing from the road and turning up in Azotus, ancient Philistine Ashdod, and then crossing the coast, preaching all the way to Caesarea. Hold on to that destination. We're going to run into him there again. 20 years later, hosting a man who, at this exact point in the story, would still be hunting him down. Because now it's finally time to talk about him. Saul of Tarsus. The text introduces him with a brutal image, breathing. Threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, and what he does isn't some improvised raid. He goes to the high priest and asks for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, authorizing him to bring prisoners back to Jerusalem, men and women. Men and women, that detail repeats 3 times. This wasn't a selective persecution, and on the road, something happens. But before I tell it, I want to take an image out of your head, because you have it stuck there, and it isn't from the Bible. There's no horse. Read it as many times as you want. The episode gets told 3 times in Acts, in chapter 9, again in chapter 22, and again in chapter 26. And in none of the 3 does a horse appear. No mount, no fall from any height. The book simply says, he fell to the ground, nothing more. So where did the horse come from? From centuries of art that needed to dramatize the scene, with Caravaggio's painting in the early 17th century as the most famous example, an enormous horse. Filling the center of the canvas, and Saul sprawled underneath it. That image became so powerful, it embedded itself in collective memory, and nobody ever double-checks it anymore. If this is genuinely useful to you, comment right now how many years you'd spent. Imagining that horse, I had it in my head too for a long time. What the account actually says is a light from heaven, a fall, and a voice asking, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And when he asks who is speaking, the answer contains the line that's going to shape his entire later theology. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Notice the identification. It doesn't say, "because you persecute my followers." It says, "you persecute me." That man is going to spend the rest of his life writing letters, comparing the community of believers to a body, with Christ as its head. The seed of that idea is in the very first sentence he heard. And here there's a technical wrinkle worth looking at head-on. The 3 accounts of this episode differ in their details. In chapter 9 it says, "His companions heard the voice but saw no one." In chapter 22, that they saw the light but did not hear the voice of the one speaking. The classic explanation is grammatical. The Greek verb for hearing changes meaning depending on the grammatical case it governs, and it can mean either to perceive a sound or to understand it. That explanation is old, and some grammarians dispute it, but there's a common-sense argument that outweighs the grammar. Both versions sit inside the very same book, written by the very same hand, only a few chapters apart. Whoever put them there? Who clearly didn't think he was contradicting himself. A forger would have made all 3 accounts uniform. Real testimonies about the same event never match word for word, and when they match too perfectly, a judge grows suspicious. They lead him to Damascus blind, 3 days without eating or drinking. And then one of my favorite characters in the entire book shows up, because he's the one most like us. A disciple in Damascus named Ananias gets the order to go lay hands on him, and what does he do? He argues. He literally talks back to the vision. "Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much harm he's done to your saints in Jerusalem." Translated, "Are you sure about this?" The answer he gets back is an entire mission statement, and I want you to hold on to it because the whole rest of the book is its fulfillment. "This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel." Gentiles, kings, Israel, write that down. By the end of this video, you're going to see that man preaching in front of a king, arguing. With Gentiles at the empire's heart and debating his own people right up to the last chapter, the whole summary of the book was in one sentence, spoken in a house in Damascus in front of a man still hesitating over whether to obey. Ananias walks in, calls him brother, to the man who had shown up carrying a warrant with his own name on it, and something like scales fell from his eyes. Like scales, again the comparison, again the caution of someone describing what has no name. And now the second myth, even more universal than the horse one. Here he doesn't change his name. It's an extremely widespread belief that he was called Saul, got converted, and God renamed him Paul to mark the new man. It's a beautiful idea. It isn't in the text. After this scene, the book keeps. Calling him Saul for 4 entire chapters, he's still Saul when he preaches in Damascus, when he escapes, when he reaches Jerusalem, when he's taken to Tarsus, when they go fetch him in Antioch, and when he's sent out on mission. The change happens much later, in one very specific place, and for one very specific reason, and when we get there, it's going to click into place like a puzzle piece. Not much further now. The end of the chapter has 2 scenes worth looking at together. First, the Jews of Damascus plot to kill him and the disciples. Lower him down the wall at night in a basket. That episode is one of the rare cases where the book of Acts and an undisputed letter of Paul's tell the very same event. In 2 Corinthians, he mentions it himself and adds a detail Acts doesn't give, that the governor under king Aretas was guarding the city in order to catch him. Aretas IV was a Nabatean king, perfectly documented, who reigned from the year 9 BC to the year 40 of our era, with his capital at Petra, with his own coins still preserved, and with a presence in Josephus. In other words, the protagonist himself, in a letter nobody disputes he wrote, anchors his escape to a datable reign and tells it as a humiliation, not as a feat. In his list of credentials, the man chooses to boast about escaping a city stuffed inside a basket. The second scene is the return to Jerusalem, and it's pure realism. Everyone was afraid of him, not believing he was really a disciple. Of course, they didn't believe him. This man had thrown their friends in prison, so who vouches for him? Barnabas, the same Cypriot Levite who had sold his land. He takes him, brings him to the apostles, and vouches for him personally. Without that guarantee, Christian history might have looked different. One loose thread before we move on. In Galatians, Paul tells this same period and says that after Damascus, he went to Arabia, came back to Damascus, and only went up to Jerusalem after 3 years. Acts compresses all of that into a few verses, giving the impression of a fast sequence. A contradiction, not necessarily. A condensed narrative isn't a false one, and the book is clearly compressing. But it is a real tension between the 2 sources. Scholars do discuss it, and I'd rather you hear it from me than from some video that wants to use it against you. They send him off to Tarsus, and he vanishes from the story for years. Meanwhile, the main character becomes Peter again, and what happens to him on a rooftop at mealtime is going to break the last remaining barrier. Before the rooftop, there are 2 brief scenes on the coastal plain worth not skipping. In Lydda, Peter finds a man named Aeneas, paralyzed and bedridden for 8 years. And in Joppa, a woman named Tabitha dies, which in Greek translates to Dorcas, and whom the account describes as abundant in good works and in acts of charity, which she did. And constantly. When Peter arrives, the local widows show him, weeping, the tunics and garments she had made for them. Notice a detail that gets lost in translation. To introduce her, the text uses a Greek word, methetria, which is the feminine form of disciple. It's the only time in the whole New Testament this form appears, the only woman explicitly called a disciple, with her own grammatical gender, in the entire canon. The community misses her so badly they send for an apostle in another city. And there's one more. Detail, even quieter, that anticipates everything that comes after. The text says, Peter stayed many days in Joppa, in the house of a certain Simon, a tanner. A tanner. The trade of tanning hides involved handling animal carcasses and working with substances that left a smell. Impossible to ignore. It was a socially awkward and ritually problematic trade, which is why the text itself notes that the house stood by the sea, on the outskirts. The leader of the Jerusalem community had been sleeping for days in the house of a man, whose trade respectable people avoided. The boundary was already shifting before the vision ever came. And now, at last, Caesarea. Caesarea Maritima wasn't a Jewish city, it was a Roman city, forcibly built on a coastline with no natural harbour, the work of Herod the Great, with a gigantic artificial port built using hydraulic concrete that set underwater. Josephus describes it with astonishment, and underwater archaeology has confirmed both the technique and the scale. It was the Roman administrative capital of the province, with a theatre, a hippodrome, and a garrison. And from that very city, incidentally, comes the most famous piece of evidence we have for the man who condemned Jesus. In 1961, an Italian team excavating the theatre at Caesarea found a limestone block reused as a step, with a fragmentary Latin inscription bearing the name of Pontius Pilate and his title. It's the only known contemporary mention of Pilate carved in stone, and it also settled a detail. His administrative title was exactly right. That's the setting. And living in that setting is Cornelius, a centurion of the unit called the Italian cohort. The page describes him as devout and God-fearing, who gave generously to the people and prayed to God constantly. That phrase, God-fearer, isn't decoration. It designated a real, well-documented social group. Gentiles who admired Jewish monotheism, attended synagogue, financially supported the community, and kept part of the rules, but never took the final step of circumcision and full conversion. They were inside and outside at once, and they're going to become the seedbed of Christianity across the whole Mediterranean, because they were people already familiar with Jewish scripture to whom nobody had offered full belonging. On the military unit, there is some debate. Inscriptions document an Italian cohort in Syria, and some historians dispute whether it was deployed in Judea in exactly those years. It's an open question, and I'll tell you that anyway, rather than hide it. Cornelius has a vision and sends for Peter, and while his messengers approach Joppa, Peter goes up to the roof to pray, gets hungry, and falls into a trance. What he sees is a sheet coming down from heaven, holding every kind of animal, and a voice telling him, "Rise, kill, and eat." And he refuses, and his refusal is magnificent, because it's the refusal of a man proud of his own record. "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." The voice answers, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happens 3 times, and the sheet goes back up. And here's the key almost everyone skips, the one that settles the passage without needing to argue about food. The text itself interprets the vision a few verses later, and it does it through Peter's own mouth, when he enters Cornelius's house. You know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to associate with or visit a foreigner, but God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Any man The vision was about animals, and the explicit application the page itself gives is about people. Whether that also implies something about food laws is a legitimate discussion that's been open for centuries, and there are serious readers on both sides. What isn't up for debate is the application the book itself gives it. It's written right there. Peter walks into the house, an observant Jew crossing the threshold of an officer in the occupying army, and Cornelius falls at his feet. Peter lifts him up with a line that ought to be framed in every church office in the world. "Stand up, for I too am only a man," and he begins to speak. And halfway through the sentence, something happens that breaks the whole script. The Spirit falls on the listeners before baptism, before any formality, before Peter even finishes. And the narrator describes the faces of those who had come with him with one exact word. They were astonished. They had just seen the exact same thing they themselves had received, given to uncircumcised people, in the living room of a Roman officer. Peter can only say one thing: can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we did? If you've made it this far, this is the point in the video where I ask you to share it with someone. Because what just happened in that house is the reason you, probably without a single drop of Jewish ancestry, are watching this today. Now comes what proves this wasn't just a nice scene, but a genuine institutional crisis. Peter returns to Jerusalem, and an accusation is waiting for him. And look closely at what it is. They don't object to him baptizing Gentiles, they object to him eating with them. "You went into the house of uncircumcised men, and you ate with them. The table, always the table." The hardest boundary wasn't doctrinal, it was domestic. And here there's a literary signal worth its weight in gold. The author has just told us the whole story of Cornelius in lavish detail, and now, in the very next chapter, he has Peter tell the whole thing over again. And later on, at the council, it gets summarized a third time. Count the times with me. Once in chapter 10, again in chapter 11, again in chapter 15. When an ancient narrator repeats the same episode 3 times in a book racing at full speed through 30 years of history, he isn't padding it out, he's underlining it. For the author of Acts, this is the turning point. What happens next takes place 500 kilometers to the north, in Antioch of Syria. Antioch was a beast of a city, the empire's third largest after Rome and Alexandria, capital of the province of Syria, with a population modern estimates place in the hundreds of thousands. The numbers vary a lot depending on the method, so take them as orders of magnitude, with a large Jewish community and a constant ethnic mix. And there, some of those who had fled the persecution did something nobody had authorized. They started speaking to the Greeks too, with no permission, no plan, no counsel. Jerusalem sends Barnabas to check on things, and Barnabas does the second best thing he ever did in his life. He goes to Tarsus to find Saul, who had been out of the story for years, and brings him back to Antioch. They spent a year there teaching, and in Antioch, the text says, the disciples were called Christians for the very first time. That name deserves a minute. The Greek word Christianos is built with a suffix that isn't even Greek. It's Latin, the same one that appears in Herodians or in supporters of Caesar. It meant roughly those on the side of. It's the kind of administrative or popular label that outsiders slap onto a group once it's visible enough to need a name at all. And there's internal proof that they didn't choose it themselves. In the entire New Testament, the word Christian appears only 3 times, and not once Is it a believer naturally calling himself that? What did they call themselves? The book of Acts repeats it over and over. The Way. Followers of the Way, that's what they called themselves. The name that 2 billion people identify with today was born as a label their neighbors stuck on them. And in Antioch comes the first humanitarian operation in Christian history. A prophet named Agabus comes down and announces there's going to be a famine across the whole inhabited world. The text adds a dating detail. This happened in the time of Claudius, and that can be verified through several independent paths. Josephus describes a severe famine in Judea during the governorship of Alexander, and tells how Queen Helena of Adiabene, a convert to Judaism, bought grain in Egypt and figs in Cyprus to relieve Jerusalem's population. Suetonius, in his biography of Claudius, mentions repeated failed harvests and shortages during that reign, and Tacitus records an episode of scarcity in Rome around the same time. 3 non-Christian sources, written by people with not the slightest interest in supporting this account, describe the exact same context of a food crisis in the same period, and the community in Antioch, newly arrived Gentiles, people with no obligation whatsoever to Jerusalem, takes up a collection and sends it to Judea with Barnabas and Saul. And then, in Jerusalem, a king decides enough is enough. Herod Agrippa I was a grandson of Herod the Great, raised in Rome, a personal friend of 2 emperors, and at that moment ruling territory nearly as large as his grandfather's. Unlike others in his family, he took great care of his image as an observant Jew, and persecuting this movement was popular. What the text does next is startlingly terse. It says he killed James, John's brother, with the sword, and moves right on. That's James, son of Zebedee, one of the inner circle of 3, one of those who had stood on the mountain of the Transfiguration. It's the only death of a serving apostle narrated anywhere in the New Testament. Judas's end also gets told, but by then he had already stopped being one, and it takes up half a line. Think about what that says about this book. If this were propaganda, the martyrdom of the first apostle would be the chapter's emotional climax, a final speech, a miracle, the executioner's conversion. Here there's none of that, one sentence, because the author is telling a different story and doesn't stop to manufacture martyrs. After that they arrest Peter, right in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, planning to bring him out to the people after Passover. And the text gives the prison detail. 4 squads of 4 soldiers each guarded him, and he slept chained between 2 of them. And that night, according to the account, an angel wakes him with a strike to the side, the chains fall off, and leads him out. And there's a wonderful line. Peter walks out believing he's seeing a vision, and only once he's already in the street, and the angel disappears. Does it hit him that what's happening is real? To me, this is the most human scene in the New Testament. Peter reaches the house where the community is gathered, praying specifically for him. He knocks. A servant girl named Rhoda comes out, recognizes his voice, and in her excitement doesn't open the door, runs off to tell the others, leaving him in the street. The very people praying for his release tell the girl, "You're out of your mind." When she insists, they say, "It must be his angel." Read that again. They'd been praying for a miracle. The miracle arrived and knocked on the door, and they argued with the messenger and left the miracle waiting outside. Nobody trying to make the first Christians look good writes a passage like that. It's written by someone reporting what he was told, including the embarrassing part. Peter motions for them to be quiet, tells them what happened, and the text simply says he left and went to another place. From that point on, the book's spotlight slips out of his hands, and it doesn't come back. The chapter closes with the king's death, and this is one of the passages best suited for comparison with an outside source, so let's do it properly. Acts tells us that Herod, in Caesarea, on an appointed day, put on royal robes, sat on the tribunal, and made a speech to the people who acclaimed him, shouting that this was the voice of a god and not of a man, and that instantly an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give the glory to God, and he died, eaten by worms. Josephus tells the very same story, in far more detail, in Book 19 of his Antiquities. He says it happened in Caesarea during games held in the emperor's honor, that Herod entered the theater at dawn, wearing a robe woven entirely of silver, that when the first rays of sun hit the fabric, the metal shone with an overwhelming brilliance, that his flatterers began calling him a god and begging him for mercy, as if he were a higher being, that he did not rebuke them, and that immediately afterward he felt a violent pain in his stomach, was carried to the palace, and died 5 days later. Compare the two accounts point by point. They agree on the city, on the public occasion, on the striking clothing, on the divine acclamation, on his accepting it, on the attack being immediate, and on his death. They differ on one thing, the mechanism. Josephus describes abdominal pain. Acts says, eaten by worms. And here it doesn't do to settle for half the picture. The phrase, eaten by worms, was, in Jewish literature, an established formula for describing the death of tyrants who believed themselves gods. In 2 Maccabees, it's used in exactly that way about Antiochus IV. Josephus himself uses equally horrifying imagery for the agony of Herod the Great. This is language loaded with theological meaning, not a forensic report. So what do we actually have? Two authors, one Jewish and non-Christian, the other Christian, writing separately, who agree on a public event with witnesses. A king acclaimed as a god in a theater who collapses on the spot and dies days later, each interpreting it in his own vocabulary. That isn't science confirming the Bible. It also isn't the Bible being legend. It's exactly what a historian expects to find when two independent traditions remember the same scandal. And hold on to this fact, because it's the second anchor point, and you're going to need both. Agrippa I died in the year 44. That gives us a second firm anchor on the timeline. The chapter ends with a line that sums up the whole book in 5 words. But the word of the Lord grew and multiplied. The king who tried to stop it is dead. The apostle he imprisoned is free. And in Antioch, a group of Gentiles has just decided it's time to go out looking for more people. That's where the second half of this story begins, and the man who's about to take the lead is still called Saul, but not for much longer. Chapter 13 opens with a list of 5 names, and that list is a sociological X-ray, almost nobody. Read slowly. In the church at Antioch, the text says, there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been raised alongside Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Look at who these men are. Barnabas, a Levite from Cyprus. Simeon, nicknamed with a Latin word meaning black, very likely of African origin. Lucius of Cyrene, on the coast of modern-day Libya. Saul, a Pharisee from Cilicia, trained in Jerusalem. And Manaen, the Greek word, used to describe his relationship with Herod Antipas, is Syntrophus, meaning raised together with a childhood companion, something like a foster brother, at the court of Antipas, the tetrarch who had John the Baptist beheaded, the same one who interrogated Jesus on the night of his trial, A man who grew up right beside that same figure inside the palace is now among the leaders of the Antioch community. An African, a Libyan, a Cypriot, a Pharisee, and an aristocrat from Herod's own court, leading. Together, that group looks like nothing else that existed in the ancient world, where religious associations and guilds were rigidly organized by origin and by class. Out of that group, the first two are sent out, and their first destination is Cyprus. Because it was Barnabas's home territory, nobody starts with the unknown. You start where you already have contacts. They cross the island east to west, from Salamis to Paphos, and there they run into the governor. Now pay attention, because this paragraph is exactly the kind that decides whether an ancient book is serious or not. The account calls the governor of Cyprus Anthipatos, which is the exact Greek word for proconsul. And that word is correct for one very specific reason. Cyprus had at one point been an imperial province, governed by a delegate of the emperor. But in the year 22 BC, it became a senatorial province, and senatorial provinces were governed by proconsuls. If the author had gotten the category wrong, it would be like writing today that a Mexican state is governed by a mayor, and the name he gives is Sergius Paulus. Did he exist? Here's the real state of the evidence, with its bright spots and its shadows. There are three pieces. The first turned up in 1877 in Soli on Cyprus's north coast, an inscription mentioning a proconsul named Paulus. The problem is, it doesn't preserve the full name, so it can't be proven to be the same man. The second is in Rome, an inscription about the curators of the Tiber's banks and channel, which includes a Lucius Sergius Paulus, datable to the 40s, meaning just a handful of years before the Cyprus episode. And that kind of post was a normal. Rung in the career of a senator who would later go on to govern a province. And the third is the inscriptions that William Ramsay and his team found in 1912 and 1913 near Antioch of Pisidia, which mention yet another Lucius Sergius Paulus, the younger, and a Sergia Paula, which means the family held property in that region. So how far can we go? Here is what can honestly be affirmed. The Sergius Paulus family existed, held senatorial rank, is documented in stone, and the chronology fits. That the proconsul of Cyprus is the same man as the one in the inscriptions is probable, and probable is not the same thing as proven. And there's a narrative detail that adds to the picture. Right after this encounter, the group does something odd. Instead of following the coast, they head inland and climb up to Antioch of Pisidia, more than 1,000 meters up, crossing a region notorious for its bandits. Why go there of all places? The working hypothesis is that Sergius Paulus gave them contacts from his own family, which is a hypothesis, but it fits the geography of the inscriptions and explains a route change that would otherwise make no sense. And now, right in the middle of this scene, with no ceremony, comes the piece I've spent an hour and a half promising you. The account says, quite literally, then Saul, who is also called Paul. That's it. No voice from heaven, no ceremony, no name-changing rite. The Greek phrase used, hokai, meaning who is also, is the standard formula in the Roman world for introducing someone who had two names. It turns up constantly in papyri, contracts, and inscriptions of the period, in exactly that format, so-and-so, who is also so-and-so, because that's how it worked. A Jew with Roman citizenship had a Roman name and a Jewish name. Paulus was a perfectly common Latin cognomen, meaning small or lesser. Saul was the name of Israel's first king, and notably the most famous king from the tribe of Benjamin, exactly the tribe he came from, the one he boasts about in his own letters. He had both names from birth. He didn't change his name, he changed his audience. The moment the story leaves the Jewish world and enters the Greco-Roman one, the narrator starts using the name that world understood, and there's a lovely stylistic proof of this. Before this point, the book always writes Barnabas and Saul in that order. From here on, it writes Paul and his companions, Paul and Barnabas. The order flipped, with no comment, no explanation, no drama. Leadership had changed hands, and the narrator recorded it using nothing more than the order of two names. Nobody fabricates a detail like that. In Perga, something else small happens, one that's going to have enormous consequences. John, also called Mark, leaves them and goes back to Jerusalem. The text doesn't say why. Hold on to that blank space because it's going to explode 2 chapters from now. In Antioch of Pisidia, Paul preaches in the synagogue, and the pattern plays out that's going to repeat through the whole second half of the book. Initial interest, enormous enthusiasm among the God-fearing Gentiles, and then a break with the synagogue leadership. And then he speaks the line that marks the turning point. To you it was indeed necessary that the word of God be spoken first. But since you reject it, look, we now turn to the Gentiles. They're driven out of the city and head to Iconium, and from Iconium to Lystra. And in Lystra something happens that, if you don't know the cultural background, just sounds comical. With the background, it gives you chills. Paul heals a man lame from birth, and the crowd, in their local language, the account specifies they were shouting in Lycaonian, meaning neither Greek nor Latin. But their own local tongue starts shouting that the gods have come down in the form of men. They call Barnabas Zeus, and they call Paul Hermes, and the account explains why with one dry, wonderful line: because he was the one who did the talking, and the priest of the temple of Zeus shows up, which the text places just outside the city, with bulls and garlands ready to offer a sacrifice. Why did they react like that? Why those 2 gods specifically, and why such urgency? Because a legend was circulating in that region, one we know from an independent first-rate source. The Roman poet Ovid, in Book 8 of his Metamorphoses, tells the story of Jupiter and Mercury, the Latin names, for Zeus and Hermes, who came down disguised as mortals to that very same region of Phrygia, in the interior of Asia Minor, and asked for shelter, house after house. 1,000 doors were shut. Only one elderly poor couple, Philemon and Baucis, took them in and gave them what little they had. The gods flooded the whole region as punishment, spared the couple, and turned their hut into a temple. In other words, the people of that region had been telling each other for generations a story about those very same 2 gods, traveling together in disguise, testing the hospitality of the locals, and devastating the region when they weren't recognized. And suddenly, 2 strangers show up and heal a cripple everyone in town knew. Their reaction wasn't random superstition, it was cultural panic. They were trying not to repeat their grandparents' mistake. Paul and Barnabas tear their clothes and push into the crowd, shouting that they are men like everyone else. And the text adds a line that sounds like an admission of near failure. Even saying these things, they hardly managed to keep the crowd from sacrificing to them. Hardly. They barely pulled it off. And then the mood flips with a speed that's honestly frightening. Agitators arrive from the previous cities, win the crowd over, and the very same people who wanted to worship them stone Paul, drag him out of the city, and leave him for dead. That episode has cross-confirmation in 2 Corinthians. In a list where he enumerates his sufferings, Paul writes that he was stoned once in his own letter, not in a story about him. And what he does next is the hardest thing in the whole chapter to believe. He gets up and walks straight back into the city. The next day he continues on his journey, and weeks later comes back along the same route, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, to organize the communities he had founded with a message that isn't exactly a sales pitch. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. That's the slogan. You are going to suffer. Welcomed. One last detail closing later on. In Lystra lived a teenager named Timothy, son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. When Paul passes through again and takes him along, that young man will already have seen with his own eyes what they did to his teacher in the new town square, and he'll still get on the road anyway. They go back to Antioch, gather the community and tell them God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And that news, which in Antioch got celebrated as a victory, in Jerusalem landed like a bomb. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch with a clear message. Unless you are circumcised according to the rite of Moses, you cannot be saved. And before you jump to the obvious side, I want you to hear their argument, well built. Because if you only ever hear the winner's version, you won't understand anything that was actually at stake. Their case was this: God gave Abraham circumcision and called it an everlasting covenant in his flesh. Everlasting. The law of Moses had never been repealed by anyone. Jesus himself was circumcised. On the 8th day, went up for the feasts and argued about the correct way to keep the law, not about whether to keep it at all. And the prophets had foretold that the nations would come to learn God's instruction, not that the instruction would be abolished to accommodate them. Add to that the practical argument. If people come in keeping nothing at all, within 2 generations the movement loses its identity. That's a serious, biblical, coherent argument. These weren't fanatics, they were conservatives with texts in hand. And against that, what did the other side have? An experience. A house in Caesarea where something happened nobody had planned. They go up to Jerusalem, the meeting is convened, and there, in chapter 15, Peter speaks for the last time in the book. His argument rests on one point: God gave them the Holy Spirit, just as he gave it to us, without making any distinction. And then he drops the question that diffuses the whole debate. Why do you put God to the test? By placing on the disciples' neck a yoke that neither our fathers nor we ourselves have been able to bear. And after that, Peter vanishes from the book. His final recorded line in Acts is a defense of Gentiles being admitted with no conditions. The one who closes the discussion isn't an apostle, it's James, the brother of Jesus, the same man who, according to the Gospels, did not believe in him while he was alive. Now he presides over the Jerusalem community and delivers the verdict. And his argument has a technical detail worth knowing. He quotes the prophet Amos and quotes him in a version that says, "The rest of mankind will seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles over whom my name is invoked." The problem is that the Hebrew text of Amos says something else. It talks about possessing the remnant of Edom. The reading that supports the argument is the Septuagint, the Greek translation. Is that a trick? No. It's the reality of 1st century Judaism. The Bible read in Greek was the Bible of millions of diaspora Jews, and the differences between the 2 versions are an entire field of study on their own. And there's a fact that adds depth to it. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew texts turned up that, in some passages, actually agree. with the Septuagint and not with the Hebrew text standardized centuries later. In other words, the Septuagint wasn't always translating badly. Sometimes it was translating a different Hebrew source. I'd rather tell you this than pretend it doesn't exist. James's verdict is A. Compromise, don't burden the Gentiles who convert, but ask 4 things of them. Abstain from what's polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from what's been strangled, and from blood. Why these 4 and no others? The most widely accepted explanation is that they correspond fairly closely to the rules the book of Leviticus imposes, not only on Israelites, but also on the foreigner living among them. In other words, it's not a catechism, it's a protocol for coexistence, the bare minimum needed for an observant Jew and a Gentile to be able to sit at the same table without either one having to stop being who he was. And now notice the sentence they use to draft the letter, because it's one of the boldest ever written. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us, both sides. Negotiated a middle ground agreement and signed it, acknowledging the 2 hands behind the document, and one flank remains open. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul describes a meeting in Jerusalem with Peter and James about this very same issue. And the details don't line up perfectly with this chapter. Whether it's the same meeting told by 2 participants, whether they're 2 separate meetings, or whether Galatians corresponds to an earlier trip, is one of the longest-running and least resolved debates in Pauline studies. There's no consensus, and I'm telling you that before someone else tells you, with worse intentions, and right after this, the book does something no hagiography would ever do. Paul proposes to Barnabas that they go back and visit the communities. Barnabas wants to bring John Mark. Paul refuses because the young man had abandoned them in Pamphylia, and the narrator uses a brutally strong Greek word. There arose such a sharp disagreement between them that they parted from each other. The word is paroxysmos, where our word paroxysm comes from. It isn't a difference of opinion. It's an explosion, and there's no reconciliation in the scene, no embrace, no moral of the story. Barnabas takes Mark and sails off to Cyprus, vanishing from Acts forever. Paul takes Silas and continues by land. There's only one epilogue, and it's outside this book. In the letter to Philemon, one that absolutely nobody disputes, Paul wrote, a certain Mark appears among those with him, sending greetings. Years later, the young man who once abandoned them is back on the team. The page doesn't underline it, doesn't even mention it. It's simply, if you read everything, it's right there. In Lystra, they pick up Timothy, and Paul does something that seems to contradict everything he just defended at the council. He circumcises him, and before you think it, I'll say it myself, this smells like a contradiction. The apparent inconsistency is so glaring it demands an explanation. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul says he flatly refused to circumcise Titus, so why one and not the other? The classic explanation is that the 2 cases weren't the same. Titus was Gentile by both father and mother, and the demand came as a condition for salvation, so giving in would have meant surrendering the principle. Timothy, by contrast, was son of a Jewish mother, and therefore legally Jewish in the eyes of any community, an uncircumcised Jew, something that would have shut the door of every synagogue on the route. One was a matter of principle, the other a passport. There are scholars who don't buy that distinction and see it as a genuine awkwardness in the account. I'll give you both, and then the journey stalls, which is strange because the book almost never says something didn't work. Here it says so twice. They were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. They tried to go to Bithynia, and the Spirit did not allow it. Doors closed twice. They go down to the coast to Troas with no plan, and there at night Paul sees a Macedonian man begging him to cross over to Macedonia and help them. And in the very next verse comes the pronoun. Shift we talked about at the start of this video. Immediately we sought to set out for Macedonia. The narrator has just stepped onto the boat. They cross the Aegean Sea and land in Europe, and the first major city is Philippi, a Roman colony, meaning not a Greek city under Roman administration, but a transplanted piece of Rome itself, settled with army veterans, holding Italic rights and Roman citizenship for its residents, people intensely proud of it. And there's no synagogue there. The Jewish community was so small, it just met by the riverside, and the first person on the European continent to believe is a foreign woman running her own business, Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira. Thyatira, in Asia Minor, was a documented textile center with inscriptions mentioning dyers' guilds. Purple was a luxury item associated with power. We're talking about a merchant with access to high-end clientele and with a house large enough to host the entire team, which is exactly what she does. The church in Europe is born in a businesswoman's living room, and it's also born, though almost nobody tells it this way, through a slave. There was in the city an enslaved girl, of whom the account itself says she had a spirit of divination. In Greek it literally says, a python spirit, a reference to the python serpent of the Delphic oracle. It was the technical term used for those who prophesied in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere else, and her owners were making money off her. She followed them through the streets, shouting something that oddly enough was true. These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation. Days on end, until an irritated Paul turns and orders the spirit to come out. And then comes the line that opens the first legal case against Christians in Europe, seeing that their hope of profit was gone. The profit, not the theology, the money. The complaint they file is a textbook example of how to dress up an economic interest as patriotism. These men, being Jews, are throwing our city into an uproar, teaching customs that we, being Roman, are not allowed to accept or practice. They strip them, beat them with rods, and throw them in the dungeon, their feet locked in stocks. At midnight, the text says, Paul and Silas were singing hymns, and the prisoners listened. There was an earthquake shaking the foundations. The doors flew open, the chains fell loose. The jailer draws his sword to kill himself because under Roman discipline, the man responsible for an escape paid with his own life, and a shout from inside stops him. Do yourself no harm. We are all here. Nobody had fled. That's the part that hits hardest. And the next day, when the magistrates quietly order them released, Paul plays a card he'd been holding all along. They beat us publicly, uncondemned, and we are Roman citizens, and they threw us in prison, and now they want to release us quietly. No, indeed, let them come themselves and bring us out. And the magistrates are terrified, and rightly so. Flogging a Roman citizen without trial was a serious crime. Cicero, a century earlier, had built an entire famous prosecution against a corrupt governor on exactly this point, declaring that to bind a Roman citizen is a crime, and to flog one an outrage. But notice the brutal detail, because it reveals what a calculating man he was. He could have said he was a citizen before the flogging. He didn't. He let himself be beaten and played the card afterward when it no longer helped him avoid the pain. But it did leave the city's authorities in his debt and afraid. He left, leaving the newborn community under the implicit protection of magistrates who knew they had committed a crime. He walked out of Philippi with his back torn open and the city council on its knees. The next stop, a few days' journey down the great Roman highway, was the capital of the province, and there the author of Acts is going to use a word that for centuries was the favorite piece of evidence for those claiming this book was a late invention. In Thessalonica, Paul preaches 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue, and a riot breaks out. Since they can't find him, they drag a man named Jason who had hosted him before the authorities, and the charge is political and lethal. These men who have turned the whole world upside down have come here too, and they all defy Caesar's decrees, saying there is another King Jesus, another king in a free city that owed all its privileges to Rome. That accusation could have ended in executions, and now the word used to name the city magistrates before whom they drag Jason, the text doesn't use the normal Greek word. It uses politarchai, politarchs. That term appears in no surviving classical Greek author, none at all, and for a long time that was a weapon. 19th century critics pointed to that word as proof that the author of Acts didn't know the world he was writing about, that he'd invented an office that never existed or twisted the usual term. Until in 1835, someone finally read a stone correctly. In Thessalonica, there had been a Roman arch crossing the highway, the Via Egnatia, known as the Vardar Gate. On one of its blocks was a Greek inscription that opened by listing magistrates, and it used that exact word, politarchs. The arch was torn down in the 19th century, and the block with the inscription ended up in the British Museum, where it still sits, and since then the count hasn't stopped climbing. Today, more than 60 inscriptions are known that mention politarchs, 3/4 of them from Macedonia and roughly half from Thessalonica itself. The figures come from Fant and Reddish's catalogue of biblical artifacts in the world's museums, published by Eerdmans. Let's be precise here, because I want you to be able to defend this without getting knocked down. The Vardar block is later than Paul's era. What the inscriptions prove, taken together, is that the office existed in that region for centuries, and that the word was the correct one for that specific city. And that's exactly the point. The author didn't use the generic term. Anyone writing from hearsay would have used, he used the local term. In one city and in the next, he uses a different one, and later he'll use still another. They escape by night to Berea, and about the Bereans the book says something that, to me, is the finest line. In the whole book, for a channel like this one, they were more noble than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures every day to see whether these things were so, to see whether they were so. He praises them for checking, for not just taking the preacher's word, for going to the text itself to check whether what they were told actually held up. If you agree with that way of reading the Bible, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly that. From Berea, they send him to Athens. And, in the 1st century, Athens was no longer a power. It was a museum. It had lost its political power centuries before and lived off its intellectual prestige and an urban landscape saturated with statues, altars, and temples, something ancient writers who visited it describe with astonishment. The narrator says Paul's spirit was stirred within him, seeing the city given over to idols. They take him to the Areopagus, which was both a hill and a council, and ask him to explain his new teaching. And he gives the most quoted speech in the book because it's the only one that never quotes the Old Testament. He opens with a field observation. As I passed by and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, "To an unknown God." And now the question worth asking, has that altar ever been found? No. What we do have are ancient testimonies of altars dedicated to unknown gods in and around Athens. The geographer Pausanias, in his description of Greece, mentions altars to gods called unknown, in the plural, and Philostratus says something similar. In other words, the custom is documented. The exact object with that inscription in the singular hasn't turned up and probably never will because of ancient antiquity. Only a tiny fraction survives. The accurate thing to say is that the detail fits what we know of Athenian religious practice, not that it's confirmed. And then he does something brilliant. Instead of quoting Jewish prophets to an audience that wouldn't recognize them, he quotes their own poets. He says, "In him we live and move and have our being," a line tradition attributes to Epimenides of Crete, though that attribution rests on late sources and isn't certain. And he adds, "As some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." That second quote is identified with precision. It comes from an astronomical poem called Phenomena by the poet Aratus, in its 5th line. And there's a delicious wink here. Aratus was from Cilicia, the very same province as Paul. He's quoting a fellow countryman to explain to the Athenians who God really is. How did it end? Badly compared to other cities. Some mocked him when he mentioned the resurrection, others said they'd hear him some other time, and a few believed. The text names only 2, a member of the council named Dionysius and a woman named Damaris. No large church, no later letter addressed to the Athenians, no movement. The book's most famous piece of oratory is also its poorest result, and the author tells it exactly the same way. From Athens he goes down to Corinth, and here, I need to take apart the single most repeated myth in the New Testament. You've heard 1,000 times that Corinth was vice's capital, and that in the temple of Aphrodite atop the Acrocorinth there were 1,000 sacred prostitutes as part of the cult. It's a claim that shows up in sermons, in study books, and in practically every video about the letters to the Corinthians. And it doesn't hold up. Let's go to the sources. The only source for that figure is the geographer Strabo. In Book 8 of his geography, he says the sanctuary of Aphrodite was so wealthy it owned more than 1,000 sacred female slaves dedicated to the goddess by men and women. Now notice 3 problems. Strabo speaks in the past tense, and the context makes clear he's referring to archaic Greek Corinth, centuries before his own time, and that Corinth no longer existed. Rome had razed it in the year 146 BC, and it stayed practically uninhabited for an entire century. The city Paul walked into was a Roman colony, refounded by Julius Caesar, populated largely by freedmen, less than 100 years old, with Latin as its official language. It isn't the same city, it's a different one, built on top of the first one's ruins. And Strabo himself confirms this without meaning to, because a few lines later he says that in his own time, only a small sanctuary of Aphrodite remained there. The remains excavated on the summit confirm that the Roman building was small. And what do scholars actually say? Hans Conzelmann, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians for the Hermeneia series, wrote flatly that Strabo isn't talking about the present, but about the city's glorious past, and that even for that earlier period the claim isn't reliable. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who dedicated his career to the archaeology of Corinth, pointed out that sacred prostitution was never a Greek custom at all. and that if Corinth had been the exception, the silence of every other ancient author on the subject would be inexplicable. And in recent decades, the matter has been studied in depth, with Stephanie Boudin's book on the myth of sacred prostitution in antiquity, and the work of Barbet Stanley Spyth on the temples of Aphrodite in Corinth, which reaches the same conclusion. There's no solid archaeological or textual evidence. Does that mean Corinth was a quiet city? Not at all. It was a double harbor with docks on two seas, a floating population, sailors, fast money, and every vice that drags along with all of that. In any century, the problems Paul is going to have too. Correct by letter are real. What you don't need is to invent a sacred brothel to explain them. And that's the whole point. When you build your faith on false data, the day someone dismantles it, it drags everything else down with it. In Corinth, he meets a married couple, Aquila and Priscilla, and the text gives the reason they were there, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. And that too has an external record. Suetonius, in his biography of the Emperor Claudius, writes that he expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting at the instigation of a certain Chrestus. Most historians read that name as a garbling of Christ and understand that what Suetonius is describing from the outside and without understanding any of it are fights breaking out inside the Roman synagogues over Jesus in the late 40s. It isn't a unanimous reading, and some argue Chrestus was a local agitator who really had that name. But if the majority reading is correct, we have a Roman historian documenting without meaning to that the debate over Jesus had already reached the capital of the empire less than 20 years after the crucifixion. And now, the promise I made you at the start of this video. Paul stays a year and 6 months in Corinth, and at the end of that period, the leaders of the synagogue bring him before the governor's tribunal. The text says, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, in the early 20th century, a French team excavating the sanctuary of Delphi in Greece found marble fragments bearing an inscription in Greek. Over the years, 9 pieces were recovered. Once reconstructed, the text turned out to be a copy of a letter from the Emperor Claudius to the city of Delphi, which was losing population, and in it, the emperor mentions Lucius Junius Gallio, his friend and proconsul. The letter is dated in the Roman fashion, listing the emperor's titles, including the number of times he had been acclaimed imperator, Claudius's 26th acclamation. Falls in the year 52. Since proconsuls served 1-year terms, that places Gallio governing Achaia sometime between mid-51 and mid-52. And since the text of Acts says Paul had already been in the city for a year and a half when they brought him before Gallio, his arrival in Corinth falls around the autumn of the year 50. That's all it takes. With that nail fixed on the wall, you can reconstruct backward and forward the travels, the years in Ephesus, the arrest, the 2 years in Caesarea, and the arrival in Rome. It's the firmest chronological anchor the New Testament has, and it didn't come from a Christian text. It came off the wall of a temple of Apollo. And there's a color detail I love. Gallio was the older brother of Seneca, the philosopher, tutor to Nero. Seneca wrote about him that no one was ever as kind to a single person as Gallio was to everyone. Now watch what this man does, because it looks like a piece of bureaucratic paperwork, and it changed the history of Europe. His ruling was a textbook case. He didn't even let Paul speak. He essentially said, If this were a crime, I would hear you out, but since it's a matter of words and names and your own law, sort it out yourselves." And he threw them out of the tribunal. It looks like paperwork. It was enormous. A Roman proconsul had just ruled that. This was an internal Jewish matter, and Judaism was a recognized religion with a legal right to exist. That ruling functioned for years as a legal umbrella for the entire movement in the province. From Corinth, Paul heads to the city, where he's going to spend more time than in any other, and where he's going to come close to being lynched in a craftsman's riot. Ephesus was the capital of the province of Asia, one of the great ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, and above all, a sanctuary city. There stood the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a building whose footprint covered roughly 4 times the area of the Parthenon in Athens. Paul stays there longer than anywhere else. The account speaks of 3 years in total. He starts in the synagogue, and when the door closes on him, he rents a space, the lecture hall of a man named Tyrannus, where he teaches daily for 2 years. And here's a manuscript detail worth knowing. Some ancient copies of the book, from the textual family known as Weston, add a precise detail that he taught from the 5th hour to the 10th. In Roman time, that's roughly from 11 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. In other words, the dead hours when Mediterranean cities shut down because of the heat. That line isn't in the oldest manuscripts, so it isn't part of the established text, but it's so specific and so untheological that many scholars suspect it preserves a genuine local tradition. The lecture hall was free at midday because nobody wanted it at that hour, and he taught while the whole city napped through its siesta. That's when the episode with the exorcists happens. And you need to understand that Ephesus had an international reputation for magic. There existed magical formulas literally called Ephesian letters, known throughout the Greek world, carried around, written on amulets. 7 sons of a man named Sceva, whom the page calls a chief priest, try to apply the name of Jesus as if it were just one more formula. I command you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. And the answer they get back is one of the most chilling lines in the New Testament. Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize, but who are you? The result is a physical disaster and a public humiliation. And the consequence is a bonfire. Those who practiced magic brought their books and burned them. And the text notes the total value, 50,000 pieces of silver, equal to tens of thousands of days' wages for a laborer. They aren't just burning paper, they're burning wealth. That's the economic trigger for the chapter's climax. Ephesus had an industry built around the sanctuary, and it was starting to feel the pinch. Demetrius the silversmith gathers the guild's craftsmen and gives a speech opening with what actually matters, and closes with what merely sounds good. He reminds them first that from this trade we get our wealth, and only after adds that the temple of the great goddess Diana might come to be despised. And that's when it explodes. The city fills with confusion. They drag 2 of Paul's companions into the theater, and the crowd spends 2 straight hours chanting one line, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." 2 hours. The scene is so absurd, the account itself closes it with a reporter's line. Some shouted one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not even know why they had gathered. That theatre exists, excavated, open to visitors, and standard estimates put its capacity at around 24,000 spectators. And here, once again, the author's obsession with official titles shows. It says some of the Asiarchs, friends of Paul, sent word begging him not to show up at the theatre. The Asiarchs were a real provincial dignity, documented in inscriptions across Asia Minor, wealthy notables who financed the province's cults and games. In other words, the account is casually letting slip that Paul had personal contacts among the provincial elite, and the man who finally puts out the riot is an official the text calls the town clerk. That was the real executive office of a Greek city under Roman rule, the man who answered to the governor if disorder broke out. His speech is a piece of Roman legal reasoning in 3 movements. 1. Nobody disputes the fame of the temple or of the image that fell from Zeus. The Greek term alludes to something that fell from the sky, and some think the original image may have incorporated a meteorite. 2. These men have not robbed the temple, nor have they blasphemed the goddess, so there is no crime. And 3, the threat: there are courts, there are proconsuls, let them accuse one another there, because we risk being charged with sedition over today's events. Sedition, the one word Rome never forgave a city for. And that was the end of it. The assembly dissolved. Paul never even made it into the theater. His friends stopped him. That detail once again says a lot. The chapter's dramatic climax is a confrontation that never happens. The protagonist wanted in, and they wouldn't let him. If you're inventing an epic, that's where you'd slot in the great speech before 24,000 people. He leaves it out because it never happened. What follows is a farewell tour of Macedonia and Greece, and in Troas comes a scene summing up the tone of the entire book, extraordinary and utterly domestic at once. They're gathered on a 3rd floor at night with many lamps burning. Think about that physically. Dozens of oil lamps eating up oxygen in a room packed with people in summer with a speaker who has already been talking for hours because he's leaving the next day. A young man named Eutychus sits in the window, falls asleep, and drops from the 3rd floor. The text, back in first-person plural for this stretch, says he was picked up dead. Paul goes down, throws himself on him and says his life is still in him. And then, and this is the part that fascinates me, he goes back upstairs, breaks bread, eats, and keeps talking until dawn. Not one word of triumph, not one interpretation. The boy is alive. The gathering continues, and the chapter ends with the driest line possible. They took the young man away alive and were greatly comforted. Shortly after, he summons Ephesus's elders to Miletus to say goodbye, and that speech is the only one in the book addressed to believers. It's also the most personal. He reminds them he worked with his own hands to be a burden to no one, warns that after he leaves, savage wolves will come in among them, tells them they won't see his face again, and closes quoting a line of Jesus: "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Go look for it in the Gospels. It isn't in any of the 4. It's what scholars call an agraphon, a saying attributed to Jesus that circulated orally and never got recorded in any known gospel. The conclusion is unavoidable, and it's beautiful. In the 50s, his sayings were still circulating, words communities knew by heart, and not all of them ever made it into writing. This book preserved one, and then begins the journey everyone warned him he'd never return from. At every port, they tell him not to go up to Jerusalem, and in Caesarea, at the house of Philip, the same man who evangelized Samaria, 20 years later, Agabus shows up, the same prophet who predicted the famine. He takes Paul's belt, ties his own hands and feet with it, and announces this is how the Jews in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and hand him over into the hands of the Gentiles. Compare carefully what was foretold with what actually happens, because they don't fully match. An uncomfortable detail. I want you to see it. It's one of the details proving nobody touched up the text. It doesn't happen quite that way. Paul isn't bound by Jews, nor handed to the Romans. They try to lynch him, and it's the Romans who pull him from the crowd and bind him themselves. The prophecy gets the substance right, the mechanism wrong, and the author leaves it as is, without adjusting a word to make it fit. In Jerusalem, James and the elders welcome him warmly, but they raise a problem. And inside that problem is a detail that changes the picture many people have of the early church. They tell him, "You see how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law, zealous for the law." The Jerusalem community, decades after Pentecost, was still observant Judaism. It had never stopped being that. The council's agreement freed the Gentiles from obligation. It never required Jews to give up anything. To diffuse the rumor that he was teaching diaspora Jews to abandon Moses, they proposed that he join a purification rite at the temple with 4 men under a vow, and that he cover the expenses. And he agrees. That's when everything explodes. Some Jews from Asia recognize him in the temple and shout that he brought Greeks into the sacred precinct. The book clarifies where that idea came from. They had seen an Ephesian named Trophimus around the city and assumed Paul had brought him in. Now recall the piece I planted an hour ago, the stone blocks bearing the warning in Greek. The explicit prohibition, written and publicly displayed, against any foreigner crossing the balustrade, on pain of death and at his own responsibility. That accusation wasn't some minor administrative infraction. It was the one thing in the entire temple for which a Jew could demand another man's death in front of the Roman authorities and expect not to be arrested himself for it. That's why the crowd reacted the way it did, and that's why the Istanbul stone, which looks like a simple sign, is one of the keys to understanding the arrest that's going to carry Paul to Rome. They drag him out of the precinct, shut the gates, and start beating him, and the garrison is what saves his life. Here too, the page is precise about topography. The Antonia fortress stood right against the temple, with direct stairs down into the outer courtyard. Josephus describes it exactly this way, explaining that the cohort was stationed there during festivals specifically to put down riots. The tribune comes down with soldiers. The crowd stops beating him. He arrests him, ordering him bound in 2 chains. The question he asks the crowd is wonderful. Who is this man and what has he done? Since everyone shouted something different, he couldn't get a clear answer. And then, on the steps, Paul speaks to him. In Greek, and the tribune is caught off guard. You know Greek. Then aren't you the Egyptian who stirred a revolt and led 4,000 assassins into the wilderness? That throwaway line, which looks like filler, is pure gold. Josephus tells this same episode twice. An Egyptian prophet arrived in Jerusalem under Felix's rule, gathered a crowd, led them to the Mount of Olives, and promised that at his command the city walls would come crashing down. Felix attacked with troops. There was a massacre and the Egyptian escaped, never captured. In other words, a notorious fugitive, still wanted and at large, at the exact moment this scene takes place. And there's a detail I find decisive, and I want to give it precisely, because it's easy to overstate. In his first work, The Jewish War, Josephus says the Egyptian gathered 30,000 men. In his second Antiquities, written almost 20 years later, he tells the same episode and doesn't repeat that figure. What he gives instead are casualties. Felix killed 400, captured 200. 600 men, when in the other version he had claimed most of 30,000 fell. Acts for its part. And says 4,000. Notice what that actually means. The most serious numerical tension isn't between Josephus and Acts. It's inside Josephus himself, antiquity's most cited Jewish historian, giving different figures for the very same event in two of his own books. Numbers in ancient historiography are elastic, and anyone who demands of Acts an arithmetic precision they wouldn't demand of anyone else isn't practicing history. They're applying a double standard. The word assassins is also exact. It designated a real group of political assassins who mixed into the crowds during festivals and killed with short daggers hidden under their cloaks. Josephus describes them in detail. It isn't a generic word for bandits. It's the technical name of one specific faction of that moment. Paul asks to address the people from the steps, and he does it in the Hebrew tongue, which, in the usage of that time, meant what we today would call Aramaic. The text notes that hearing that language, they grew even quieter. His speech goes well right up until he says one word, Gentiles. And the shouting starts again. The tribune, fed up and unable to understand the language, orders the standard Roman method for finding the truth: flogging. And once they've tied him up, Paul throws out the question, is it lawful to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been condemned? The officer holding the strap freezes. The tribune comes running, and the dialogue that follows has an exquisite social undertone. The tribune says, I paid a huge sum to acquire this citizenship, and Paul answers, but I was born with mine. Under Claudius's reign, Roman citizenship could be bought, and it was a public scandal. The historian Cassius Dio says it sold at increasingly cheap prices, and there's one detail that clinches it. The tribune's name was Claudius Lysias. Lysias is a Greek name. Claudius is the emperor's own name. New citizens took the name of whoever granted them citizenship. In other words, a Greek man who'd bought himself the emperor's surname just discovered that the ragged Jew he was about to flog had held more rights than he did since the day he was born. And from that point on, this man stops being a wandering preacher and becomes a legal case file that Rome has to resolve. They bring him before the Sanhedrin to learn the charge. The session starts terribly. He's barely said he has lived before God in good conscience when High Priest Ananias orders him struck on the mouth, and Paul loses composure. God will strike you, whitewashed wall. Scolded for insulting the high priest, he answers with something baffling. I did not know, brothers, he was high priest. Scholars have argued for centuries whether that was sincere, whether he'd been away 20 years and missed the man, whether his eyesight was poor, or it was pure sarcasm. The narrator doesn't clear it up, and I won't either. What he does next, though, is the move of a man who knew that room from the inside because he'd once sat in it himself. He sees the court is made up of two factions that despise each other and shouts, brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. It is over the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial, and that ends the session. The Pharisees who believed in the resurrection start defending him, while the Sadducees who did not fly into a rage. The tribune has to physically drag him out before his own judges tear him apart. That night, the text says, he receives a vision with one short line that drives everything left in the book. Take courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. The next morning, more than 40 men swear not to eat or drink until they've killed him, and plan an ambush during a prisoner transfer. The plot falls apart because of the most unexpected figure in the book. The account itself says, the son of Paul's sister, hearing about the ambush, went and entered the fortress and gave warning. A nephew. It's the only time in the New Testament any relative of Paul's appears, and it tells us two things at once. He had family living in Jerusalem, and that this young man had free access to the fortress to visit him. No further detail, no name, no age, no word on what became of him. A teenager walks onto the stage, saves the main character's life, and vanishes forever. The Tribune reacts with a level of overkill that says a lot about how tense the city really was. He organizes the transfer for 9 at night with 200 soldiers, 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen, nearly half a cohort just to move one prisoner, and sends a letter to the governor. And that letter is a gem. In it, Claudius Lysias writes that he rescued Paul from the crowd after learning he was a Roman citizen. That's false. He found out later. He rescued him because of a riot, and only later, in the fortress, did he order him flogged, only then discovering his status. In other words, Acts reproduces an official Roman document where an officer dresses up the facts to look good to his superior. Nobody manufacturing an edifying story adds in a minor official's petty administrative fib. That gets included for one reason only, because it was in the file. In Caesarea, Antonius Felix is waiting for him, and about this man we have a devastating outside portrait. Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote a line about him that has become famous, that he wielded royal power with the temperament of a slave, given over to every cruelty and every whim. Felix had, in fact, been a freedman, a former slave who rose to govern a province thanks to his brother's connections at the imperial court. The trial opens with a speech from a lawyer named Tertullus, who starts with flattery so thick it would be cringeworthy today, and then launches the real accusation, that Paul is a plague, a promoter of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Notice the word sedition in the most flammable province of the empire, less than 15 years before the outbreak of the Jewish War. That accusation was a death sentence, and it was working. Paul answers with an impeccable legal defense that boils down to one point. They have no witnesses. The men who saw me in the temple were Jews from Asia, he says, and they should be here accusing me if they have anything against me. It's the classic legal objection of any Roman court. The eyewitness accusers are not present. Felix postpones the case, and here the narrator adds two details that together paint a full portrait. The first, some days later, Felix came with Drusilla, his wife, who was Jewish, sent for Paul, and listened to him speak about faith in Jesus Christ. That short line lights up once you bring in Josephus. Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa the first, who died in the theater of this very city. She was very young, already married to the king of Emesa, and Felix, per Josephus, persuaded her to leave her husband and marry him instead. And the second thing the text tells us is what Paul actually talked about in front of that couple. He discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. Self-control in front of a governor notorious for his greed, and a woman he had, convinced to leave her husband. And the account says Felix was terrified. And then comes the line that paints him completely. He was also hoping Paul would give him money to set him free. That's the moral level of the court. He spends 2 years there in Caesarea with no sentence, while a governor waits for a bribe that never comes. When Felix is removed, Porcius Festus takes over, and Jerusalem's leaders reactivate the case, requesting the prisoner's transfer to the capital, with an ambush already set along the road. Festus, no fool, proposes holding the trial in Caesarea. And that's when Paul plays his last legal card. I appeal to Caesar. That right existed, and it was the single most valuable privilege of a Roman citizen. The ability to pull your case out of provincial jurisdiction and take it straight to the imperial court. Once invoked, the governor could no longer judge him or release him. Think about it from his side. He's armored himself against murder and chained to a voyage he might never return from. Festus consults his counsel, then answers with the formula. To Caesar you've appealed, to Caesar you'll go. And he's left a rather ridiculous problem, confessed to a visitor. He must ship a prisoner to Rome, not knowing what to write in a charge sheet. The visitor is Herod Agrippa II, great-grandson of Herod the Great, and his sister Bernice. And about that woman, one thing is worth saying, because history finishes off this scene better than any screenwriter could. Years later, Bernice would become the lover of Titus, the Roman general who leveled Jerusalem, burned the temple, and later became emperor. In that very room, listening to a prisoner talk about resurrection, sat the future partner of the man who would destroy the building whose purity he was on trial for. Paul's speech before Agrippa is his complete autobiography, and it ends with a famous exchange. Festus interrupts him, shouting, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Too much learning is driving you mad." And Paul answers with perfect calm, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I speak words of truth and sound reason." And then he turns to the king. "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets?" "I know that you believe." Agrippa answers with the line, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian. A correction is needed, since this is among the most repeated lines in the Bible." The Greek behind that line is notoriously difficult, and the traditional rendering is only one possible reading. Many modern versions read it ironically, something closer to, "In so short a time, you think you can persuade me to become a Christian." In other words, not a king on the verge of conversion, but an aristocrat brushing off a preacher with an elegant exit line. So which reading is correct? Most scholars lean toward the ironic one. The emotional reading is prettier and probably not what he meant. The private conclusion the two men reach, once the audience is gone, closes the book's irony. This man could have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. His legal maneuver saved him from the ambush and chained him to Rome. Exactly what that night's vision had announced to him. And that's where chapter 27 begins, which is, without question, the finest surviving account of ancient seafaring, right alongside the classics. In 1848, a Scotsman named James Smith, an experienced sailor with classical training, published a study devoted entirely to this one chapter. He reconstructed the route, checked it against the Mediterranean's prevailing autumn winds, square-rigger handling techniques, and the region's nautical charts. His conclusion, still cited a century and a half later, was that the account has exactly the kind of precision only a witness actually on board could produce, but one who wasn't a sailor. He describes exactly what gets done, without the jargon a professional would use. Look at the details, and you'll understand why. The text says the fast had already passed, meaning the Day of Atonement, which falls in autumn. That means the sailing season was closing. The Mediterranean in winter was impassable, and everyone knew it. When a gentle south wind blows, they decide to sail on from fair havens in Crete, and a hurricane-force wind slams into them, one the narrator calls Euroaquilo. That word is a hybrid. It joins the Greek Euros, the east wind, with the Latin aquilo, the north wind. It's exactly the kind of hybrid term used by sailors in a port where the two languages mixed together, not a word a cultured writer would have chosen sitting at his desk. Then come the maneuvers. They reinforce the hull with cables, lower the rigging, start throwing cargo overboard. And on the third day, they throw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, and 14 nights adrift. Count how many nights in a row you've gone without seeing sun or a single star, knowing nobody's coming for you. And then the detail Smith found conclusive. When the sailors suspect they're nearing land, they take a sounding. 20 fathoms, a little later again, 15 fathoms. That exact rate of shallowing along that exact direction of drift matches the approach to one specific stretch of coast. It's the kind of detail nobody invents, because nobody knows it needs inventing. In the middle of the panic, the text records the exact number aboard. 276. It also notes the ugliest moment. Soldiers want to kill the prisoners, so none escape by swimming, since they'd answer with their own lives. And the man who stops it is the centurion Julius, not out of general kindness, but for a reason, the narrator states without dressing it up. Wanting to save Paul, they run aground, the ship breaks apart, everyone makes it to shore. Some swimming, others on planks. The island was Malta, and that's where the incident with the viper happens. Paul gathers dry branches. A snake comes out from the heat and fastens onto his hand. The islanders conclude he's a murderer, hunted by divine justice. And when nothing happens to him, they change their minds and decide he's a god. The modern objection is well known and deserves raising. Malta has no venomous snakes today. The usual answers to that are two, and neither one is conclusive. 2,000 years of deforestation and extremely high human density on a small island. That's enough to wipe out a reptile population. 2, the islanders, judging by its behavior, identified as a viper, a snake that might not actually have been one. Something perfectly normal in any era, and there's an even more radical underlying debate. A minority of researchers argue the Melita of the account wasn't Malta at all, but a different Adriatic island with a similar name. And some archaeologists, Anthony Bonanno among them, have pointed out that in the bay, Maltese tradition identifies as the shipwreck site. There's no archaeological evidence backing up that identification. The route and the winds clearly favor Malta, and that remains the majority position. But the debate is real, and right in that slippery ground, the account itself drops a detail brutally hard to verify and nails it. It says that area had estates belonging to the island's leading man, named Publius, and the word it uses for leading man is protos. The first man, or chief. That title is documented. Known Maltese inscriptions use it as an actual office. One in Greek names a Roman knight called Prudens Protos of the Maltese, and another in Latin says, in essence, first of all, of the municipality of the Maltese. William Ramsay pointed this out more than a century ago as technically correct for that specific island, and now add it up. In Thessalonica, Politarchs; in Cyprus, proconsul; in Ephesus, Asiarchs and town clerk; in Malta, protos. 4 cities, 4 completely different administrative systems, 4 local vocabularies, 4 bullseyes. And a caution about Ramsay, since I'm citing him. He began his career trained in the most skeptical German criticism, convinced Acts was a late composition with no historical value, and he changed his mind. While excavating in Asia Minor, that story is real, and it's impressive. It's also real that Ramsey ended up an enthusiastic defender, and that today several of his conclusions are considered overconfident. Both facts belong together. 3 months later, they set sail on another ship, an Alexandrian one that had wintered on the island, and the text even notes its figurehead. It carried the sign of Castor and Pollux, the twin gods who protected sailors. The detail serves no theological purpose whatsoever. It's there because someone saw it. They sail up through Syracuse, Rhegium, and Puteoli. And on the Appian Way, on the road to Rome, believers from the capital come out to meet them, all the way to 2 spots the text names by name: the Forum of Appius and the 3 Taverns. Both are real stops along that road, documented in Roman literature. The poet Horace mentions the Forum of Appius in one of his own travel accounts, complaining about the mosquitoes and the innkeepers. And there, in the final stretch of the road, the book notes that seeing them, Paul gave thanks to God and took courage. He arrives in Rome under guard, with a pending appeal and a chain. And then the book does exactly what I told you, right at the start. It falls silent on 2 full years, spent in a rented house of his own, receiving everyone who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God, and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ. And the very last sentence closes with 2 Greek words, with all boldness unhindered. Ekolitos, the end. Why? I'll give you the 4 serious answers without deciding for you. The first, the author wrote before he knew how it ended. It's the simplest explanation, and it has a strong argument behind it. If he wrote after the year 64, why doesn't he mention Nero's persecution, the one tradition places the deaths of Paul and Peter in? And if he wrote after year 70, why doesn't he mention, even in passing, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple? The event that split Jewish history in 2, the one that shows up everywhere in the literature of the period. A book that devotes entire chapters to disputes over the temple and says not one word about its destruction is, at the very least, striking. Historians, like Adolf von Harnack, who started out defending a late date, shifted toward an early one, partly because of this. The second, nothing is missing, this really is the ending. Remember the map the book itself laid out on its very first page. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The stated goal was never to write Paul's biography. It was to carry the message to the world center. Once it's preached in Rome, unstopped, the mission is complete. Whether the messenger lives or dies is, for that purpose, irrelevant. The third, there was planned, a 3rd volume never written or lost. It's possible, and it's unprovable. And the 4th, the original readers already knew perfectly well how it ended, so there was no need to spell it out. You don't write the ending of a story your reader already lived through. Which one's right? No consensus. Now I want you to see something almost nobody points out, and it's why this video keeps pointing out problems instead of hiding them. Remember the Theudas problem from an hour and a half ago. One of the 3 ways out was that the author had read Josephus, and Josephus published his work in the 90s. If you accept that way out, you have to date Acts late. And if you date Acts late, the silence about the temple's fall becomes far harder to explain. The 2 things pull in opposite directions. You can't keep both. That's exactly what it means to reason historically, instead of just collecting arguments that suit you. Every option closes off another door. Anyone selling a package where everything fits at no cost hasn't read the sources or is counting on you not reading them. There's one more thing that truly explains this book. Think about who disappears. Peter dominates the first 12 chapters, and his last recorded line is at the council. After that, nothing. James, son of Zebedee, dies in half a line. Barnabas walks off angry and never comes back. Philip, Stephen, Ananias, Rhoda, the nephew, the jailer, Lydia, Priscilla, they all walk in, do something decisive and walk back out. And Paul, the apparent protagonist, ends up locked away. No verdict, no final scene. Not one human character stays standing from beginning to end. There's only one who's on the first page, on the last, and every page between. In the locked room, on the rooftop in Joppa, on the road to Gaza, in Antioch saying, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul." Closing the door to Asia, opening the one to Macedonia, in the Philippi jail before the Areopagus. The book everyone calls the Acts of the Apostles has exactly one continuous protagonist, and it isn't an apostle. Now look at the book's spine, because there is something not the author's. That title isn't his either. The oldest manuscripts don't carry titles like this inside the body of the text. Headings got fixed in place later on, once scrolls had to be told apart from one another in the community's libraries. The name you know this book by came from copyists, just like Christians got theirs. Neighbors in Antioch gave them theirs. Tell me in the comments which of those 4 endings convinces you the most. I genuinely want to know, since I've spent years going back and forth, still undecided. And hold on to the very last word. A man chained inside a house that wasn't his own, in the city of the emperor who would judge him, with a guard at the door and no guarantee whatsoever that he'd still be alive the following month. And the last thing the author chooses to write about that scene doesn't describe the man. It describes the message, unhindered. If you want to keep pulling this thread, on screen I'm leaving the video where we take apart another story everybody gets wrong. That's next.